Chapter 1688. Published at 7th of March, 2023, 3:28 and 27 seconds p.m. Chapter 1688. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1688. Return it. Lionel turned around and looked up to find Erlen looking down at him. The height difference was striking despite the fact the latter looked as though he just might be blown over by a strong gust of wind any time now. Need something? Lionel asked with a smile. The white lion bow. Return it. Erlen's voice was quite soft, and despite the words he spoke he even sounded quite shy. He sounded decades younger than he really was, almost like a prepubescent boy. But by a different token, his voice wasn't particularly high-pitched either. It was just a very odd feeling to give off for someone who was so tall. Lionel's smile, though, didn't fade when he heard this. Even if I placed the bow right here, would you even be able to pick it up? Don't you think it would be embarrassing if I planted the bow right in the middle of your archery faction, and see how long it stayed in place? Hearing Lionel's words, fury danced in the eyes of the spectators. Lionel was smiling, but whether it was his words or the intentions behind them, both were incredibly vicious. If Lionel left the white lion bow here as he was asked, and none were able to gain its acknowledgement, how embarrassing would that be for their faction as a whole? They had already been lagging behind the spear and sword factions for centuries, and were only just starting to slowly catch up thanks to the existence of Nazag and the other Terrius family geniuses. But if this happened now, how hard of a blow would it be? This isn't something you need to worry about, Erlen responded. Return the bow. Lionel continued to smile as he opened his mouth. Piss off. The spectators shuddered. It was hard to believe that someone could say such a thing with a smile on their face. He didn't even seem to be particularly angry, and he also didn't seem to take Erlen very seriously at all despite the latter's tier 8 strength. At that moment, Erlen's expression darkened, though it was difficult to tell considering how black the bags under his eyes already were. Are you sure that's your answer? Are you sure that it was smart to get this close to a spearman when your main weapon is that bow? Lionel replied with the very same smile. Erlen's pupils constricted, but Lionel's fingers had already pierced outward. He could do nothing as watched those fingers touch chest, a violent pressure swirling around them. Bang! A hole was ripped through Erlen's chest, through his ribs, ravaging his lungs and shattering his shoulder blade on the way out. The residual pressure was so strong that he shot backward even faster than he had come, shearing past the crowd and landing against the bow pagoda in the distance with a blood-curdling crack. The bow pagoda didn't so much as tremble, leaving Erlen's body to take the full brunt of the blow. 20 years ago, one of you threatened me with declaring war on the Morales family if they found out that I claimed the white lion bow through inscrutable methods. But 20 years later, after you were unable to prove this, you just settled for asking for it back just because? Aren't you embarrassed? I don't actually know much about the white lion bow or its history. What I do know is that it's a present from someone I care quite a bit about, and that's reason enough for me to not return it to you. What I can say, though, is that even if I didn't have this reason, I still wouldn't return it. Lionel flipped over his palm to reveal a gorgeous bow dancing with white gold lights that bathed the surroundings in both a holy and oppressive aura. You want a bow this beautiful to rot for all eternity in a glass case? How ridiculous. Aina watched Lionel's back and couldn't help but smile. Usually Lionel would care to speak so many words. The root of it was that he had always disdained to explain himself, and talking too much to enemies was just an extension of that. Even when someone infuriated him, he would just prefer to pummel them into the ground. Now though he seemed to be quite talkative and she found it funny, mostly because when he spoke he was really too good at pissing people off. How difficult was it to win an argument against someone who thought hundreds of times faster than you? At that moment, though, a suffocating aura flashed over from the distance. In fact, there wasn't just one, there were two of them, each with presences that far surpassed the sixth dimension. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he looked up, quickly finding two characters landing atop a building adjacent to the public square. This wasn't too surprising. If Lionel's uncle and aunt oversaw the spear faction, then how could the archery faction not also have its own seventh-dimensional powerhouses? The real question, though, was what were they doing here? Did they want to interfere as well? Fighting in the archery faction is prohibited. All violators will be expelled and suspended from entry for 10 years. Please leave. Lionel raised an eyebrow, watching the two for a moment before smiling and nodding. Without another word, he took Anna's hand and turned to leave. He had already gotten everything he needed out of the archery faction anyway. Although it was a bit unfortunate that he didn't get to learn any specific techniques, any techniques here could also be found in the Void Library with some added effort. The Bao Deity faction could only grit their teeth as they watched Lionel leave. They wanted to wipe the smirk off his face with every fiber of their being, but taking Erlin as an example, it didn't seem that this would be a possibility for them. Their fury bubbled up inside them, causing the atmosphere to be greatly stifling, but in the end, no one did a single thing. It felt that the only hope was to wait for the decision of their leader, Nazag. Chapter 1689. Published at 7th of March, 2023, 3:27 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 1689. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1689. Here the two seventh-dimensional overseers stood with their hands clasped behind their backs as Lionel left, but hidden flicker danced within their eyes as they did so. It was clear that they weren't happy with this result either, but there was little to nothing that they could do about it. Attacking with their strength was another taboo of the Void Palace. They simply couldn't do it. The both of them were also members of the Bao Constellation Alliance. One of them went by Abe Lion, and the other went by Sankas. Although neither of them was a member of the Terrius family, they still held quite a bit of strength in their own right. Years ago, they could only watch the White Lion Bao be taken away by that woman. And now her son had come by, seemingly to rub it in their faces. Suspending him for 10 years was about all that they could do, but Lionel didn't seem to care about it at all. Should we have really let him go like that? Abe Lion asked. And what were our other choices exactly? This is already the second time you've given me that answer. And it's just as frustrating as the first time. It is what it is. When someone climbs to the 12th floor, they're allowed to try their chances at claiming the White Lion Bao. Before, his mother had done it for him, and we could have used that as a pretext to take it away from him. If not for the fact that he seemed to be capable of using the Bao just fine. Some thought that it was because his father used some nefarious means, but we have no way of proving that, or at the very least, there's no obvious method of doing so. And now that he's legitimately climbed to the 12th floor on his own, there's even less that we can do about it. The two fell into silence, their teeth silently clenched as their expressions remained unmoved. The White Lion Bao is the last beacon we have of the Alliance's former glory. Allowing it to fall into the hands of an outsider like this is a disgrace. These were the last words the two said on the topic. There was simply nothing else to be said. The White Lion Bao's history wasn't as complex as some thought. In fact, it was so simple that it could be summarized in a single line. It was the only Bao the Alliance had from the Bao domain ring, and the only one among them that they managed to keep. This Bao was the last weapon used by the last human owner of the Bao domain ring. But since then, it has been unusable by those who came next, unwilling to acknowledge anyone. It represented a historic slight, a stain on their lineage, and a slap to their faces. At the same time, it was a reminder that they still had a mission to avenge this disgrace. And yet, now this symbol of their pride was taken away by not just anyone, but a member of the Morales family. To say that this was a humiliation was an understatement. You're getting addicted to causing trouble, Aina teased. Lionel laughed. This time it really wasn't his fault. All he did was climb the tower, then some pandied bastard asked him to return something his mother gave to him as a present. What was he supposed to do exactly? Give it back obediently? He knew that there was probably some special significance to this Bao in his hand, but that wasn't enough for him to change his mind about it. Plus, the so-called nefarious means they kept accusing him of using was all nonsense. They all assumed that his father had done something considering his skill in crafting, forcing the Bao to submit to him. If this happened, it would be an even worse humiliation than an outsider claiming the Bao, and it wasn't something that they could accept, even to the point of being willing to declare war. However, there was no evidence of such a thing happening. In fact, Lionel himself knew that his father had never even seen him use the Bao before. And by now, if the Bao had been tampered with, although Lionel could say that he had caught up to his father in crafting, He could at least say with confidence that he would know if a bow he was using had been tampered with. I'm not going around looking for trouble, but I think I've stopped caring even if it comes for me. Then what now? Of course we should go see Auntie. I was accused of using facilities for free. Wouldn't it be an injustice if I didn't take more advantage of this good deal? Aina shook her head and rolled her eyes. This man was really becoming a villain. Lionel laughed and scooped up Aina's small waist, vanishing in a flicker. With his speed, it was barely a few minutes before he made it to the Spear faction's territory. The Spear faction had been in a poor situation when Lionel was last here, but from what he could see now, they had already recovered and then some. But this made sense. While the Spear faction had lost the stalwart polearm party after it was demoted to a faction, it still had his 6 cousins. Plus, this information of Lionel's was quite outdated. The stalwart polearm party had already been recovered under the hands of First Nova. The Spear faction was already flourishing with a great air. Just as Lionel was about to step into the faction, though a booming crashing sound came from right before him. Bang! A familiar woman that looked as though she had just stepped out of a vat of oil landed heavily before Lionel. She was none other than Ness, Montez's wife and Lionel's aunt. Lionel smiled and went to greet her, but in return he gained finger pinch to the earlobe. 36,500,000 void points. 365 void merits. Where's my payment? Lionel blinked, feeling a pain spike through his ear and body. Where was the hello? How've you been? How about an oh you managed to survive, that's great. I was worried about you. Where was the justice? About that, Uncle Montez. Lionel's eyes lit up. Help me. Ness had snapped in the direction Lionel had looked in. Where? Lionel slipped away, activating his starry light domain, grabbing Aina, and vanishing in the blink of an eye. Ness was caught off guard before she grinned wildly. You think you've grown a pair of balls, huh? Is your sack hairy enough to run from your aunt now? Lionel nearly snapped out of his light state when he heard this, coughing hard. Why were her words so vulgar? You think I can't catch you? Ness, though, was caught off guard again, suddenly realizing that Lionel wasn't running away from the Spear faction, but was rather running into it. Before she could react, he had appeared by the Spear pagoda and dove inside, leaving Aina outside. By the time Ness pivoted and caught up, she only found Aina standing with a sheepish smile, coughing lightly. Inwardly, though, Aina was cursing Lionel. This was definitely payback for her laughing at his misfortune before. Chapter 1690. Published at 9th of March, 2023, 7:58 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1690. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1690. First floor? Lionel laughed to himself from within the pagoda, a bright smile on his face. He wasn't too worried about Aina, since Ness was his aunt. The likelihood that she would truly do something to her was very low, not to mention the binding rules of the Void Palace even if she wasn't. As for his reputation, he simply couldn't be bothered to care. Since he was a rich silk pants, he would be a rich silk pants. There would eventually come a day where no one could be bothered to care about what happened here, because his achievements would be far beyond their imagination. After he finished chuckling, Lionel looked around with a curious eye. This time he had entered the pagoda alone, skipping over a few people who had been about to enter. Though he felt a bit bad about that, it couldn't be helped. If he didn't rush in, then he would be caught. Plus, if the Bao pagoda was anything to go by, they could enter along with him even if he went in first. The surroundings, however, were different from the Bao pagoda. Rather than standing on a platform in the depths of space, Lionel stood on a large plain that looked like an endless dirt path. The land was dry and smooth, filled with a grayish-brown color. What was interesting, though, was that up above, there was once again an endless depth of space. It made it feel like the expanse of existence was peering down upon him, waiting to watch his performance. Lionel blinked, looking around for a moment until he suddenly felt the ground began to rumble. With a thought, Lionel's chain spear appeared in his hand. However, rather than rattling like it usually did, it was surprisingly calm, eerily so, in fact. But even so, the rumbling of the ground only increased as he gripped his spear. Lionel looked down at his spear, finding it to be decidedly lifeless. It was completely unlike what he had experienced from its presence before. Even back when he had yet to learn about the life grade, he still felt more personality from his spear than he did now. Is this on purpose? It sucked all the spirituality out of my spear. Ignoring the rumbling ground for a moment, Lionel flipped his palm and went through a series of spears, only to find that the feeling was exactly the same. Soon, he realized that the problem extended further than just his spears as well. Even his spear force seemed more tame and languid, as though it was struggling against falling into a deep sleep. This astonished Lionel all the more. Lionel's eyes suddenly sharpened. He had wanted to experiment more, but at that moment, over the dusty horizon, the source of the rumbling ground was quickly coming into view. Horse hooves slammed against the ground, chariots rocked and swayed, their wheels spinning so fast that it seemed as though they might fall off at any time. And a valiant general stood atop a moving tower in the center of it all at the very peak. Despite a distance of easily 3 kilometers separating them even now, Lionel felt as though the general was looking right into his soul. Let alone 3 kilometers. It felt more like they were standing nose to nose, their eyes mere inches apart. A dust cloud rose into the air, a stifling, bloodthirsty aura blanketing the skies to the point the depths of space and stars above almost turned a crimson red. Lionel stood in silence, his narrowed eyes relaxing and his expression becoming a dull cold. He could feel that everything was sealed away. The only strength remaining in his body was his spear force, but even that seemed to be quite weak. And now, he was facing an army made up entirely of Tier 1 existences. Was this really just the first floor trial? Or was it that things worked differently here? How was he supposed to defeat 10,000 experts without his full range of abilities? Especially since they were a well-trained army? Lionel's heart thumped in his chest, pushing against his ribcage and sending surges of blood through his limbs. Even before the army entered a kilometer range of him, his skin was flushed with a warm color, his gaze flickering with a deep battle intent. Whatever this trial was, it was designed to bring out the full potential of his spear domain lineage factor. In that case, he might as well go all out and see what he could learn relying solely on it. As for whether this was just the first floor or not, it seemed that only time would tell him that. With a step, Lionel began to walk forward slowly, his hair fluttering in the wind and his posture straight and unbothered. It didn't seem as though he sensed the danger coming toward him at all, as he kept his head high. A light smile spread across his lips as the ground continued to rumble. 500 meters, 400 meters, 300 meters, 200 meters, 100 meters, 50 meters. Lionel took a breath, the scent of blood and carnage filling the air. For a moment, he had a fleeting thought. Could he die in these trials? This felt like his real body after all. However, thinking to this point, he just grinned. For him to die, wouldn't they have to take him down first? His blood rushed straight to his head and a crimson glow lit his eyes. Seemingly taken by the bloodthirstiness of the battlefield, his heart threatened to beat right out of his chest. And then he took a strong step forward. Bang! A cyclone of spear force erupted around Lionel, crashing into the first line of the vanguard and shredding them into pieces. His palm opened and he reclaimed his chain spear, thrusting it forward with an undeniable momentum, and skewering the chest of a stampeding horse before pulling upward and splitting its neck and head in two. He closed his eyes, basking in the slaughter. Show me what you can do. Chapter 1691. Published at 9th of March, 2023, 7:58 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1691. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1691. Freedom. Lionel easily immersed himself in the carnage. He didn't care for time or stamina, he simply pressed forward. Every time his spear shot out, another would die. However, after several hours, he realized that what he was doing was inappropriate. This trial was one that he was flying by, true enough, but he wasn't getting what he needed to get out of it, and that was because of the one thing this trial couldn't seal: his ability index. This was the problem that Lionel had always had. He could never fully rely on his spear domain lineage factor, because his brain was too active and his ability index played too large of a role in his combat prowess. In fact, this was the reason the bow domain lineage factor seemed so much more powerful to him. It synergized with his ability index while the spear domain lineage factor did not. Or more accurately, Lionel didn't know how to allow it to synergize properly because he knew too little about the lineage factor, which was why he came here in the first place. Here, he found himself calculating exactly where to attack, who to attack first, and how to attack to ensure that he could deal with all of the enemies in his range the most effectively. While he was under a great disadvantage battling so many enemies at once, they were at a disadvantage because only so many of them could attack him at once given his size in proportion to their army. Taking advantage of that, with his ability index, it was far easier than it would be for most to deal with this situation. But this was likewise holding him back. Lionel inwardly shook his head. He had made a small breakthrough in this regard when he was battling Miguel for the first time. What had he decided on back then? Whenever he battled, he always brought out his trump cards one by one, building up to revealing his true strength, so that he had more cards in his hands to catch his enemy off guard with. But when he took this approach, it also stifled his own potential. That approach to battling lacked confidence, it assumed inferiority, and it necessitated trickery over strength. It was one thing to battle with logic instead of instinct, but the way that he did it was a problem. Even after that breakthrough, Lionel still sunk back into his usual habits. After all, changing who a person was, even for him, was too difficult. He wasn't as much of a machine as he thought he was. He too had his own tendencies, likes and loves. What was the key to fusing his logic and instinct? It was freedom, true freedom. What held him back all this time was his restraint. His logic often became a burden rather than a help to him. When he first stepped into the dimensional verse, he found it difficult to kill because he could logically deduce the value of a life. When he lost Aina, it was his logic that cut her off for good, and almost ended in him losing her forever. When he battled, it was his logic that held back his truest potential, only eking out bits and pieces of his strength at a time, so that he'd always have something in reserve to pull out and catch an enemy off guard with. But what he hadn't noticed was that this sort of mentality had seeped into the way he did everything. He still hadn't fully reconnected with Aina. He subconsciously limited his own improvement, because he never really pushed himself to the fullest extent to begin with. He even restricted his advancements, and because of the so-called boredom this brought about. Lionel didn't believe that his logic was truly a net negative, but it most definitely wasn't a net positive, forcing him to stay stagnant and unmoving. It was like an underlying anchor pulling him down. Sometimes there just wasn't a need to care so much. It was fine to be logical, but if it was also stunting your progress, how logical would that be? Sometimes it was better to be free, to be unrestrained, to let loose a bit. Lionel's spear whistled through the air, his strikes becoming less structured, and his stamina draining much faster, all while the smile on his face seemed much broader. He wanted to find it. He had already touched the surface, but he needed to dig deeper, to find where that balance was. Between his instinct and his logic, where was the dividing line that would allow them to both shine the most optimally? In his fight with Miguel, just touching the surface of this had allowed Lionel's spear force to undergo a qualitative change, giving him a crown and a bright gold spear force. His spear was relentless as his breathing became heavier, and his sweat fell like a torrential rain. Those watching might think that he was insane. His fighting style until now had been so reserved, so perfect, so unblemished, but in the blink of an eye he had become so wild and unrestrained. He immediately suffered for it. His body, which hadn't suffered even a single wound, began to split and bleed. Although his killing speed had skyrocketed, so had his stamina consumption. On top of that, the mistakes he made forced him into more and more dangerous situations he had no choice but to brute force his way out of. And yet, his grin only seemed to get wilder. Lionel could still remember the first time he stepped onto a battlefield without the guilt of human lives looming over his head. It was that day in the Camelot Zone. Faced with an army of demons he didn't care to treat like he had humans for the first time. He was free, so light, so happy. His blood had boiled, his eyes had lit up, and his force flowed more smoothly than it ever had before. And now, he could feel as though chains hidden deep within his body were loosening one after the other. The whispers of his spear domain lineage factor becoming like roars in his skull. Chapter 1692. Published at 9th of March, 2023, 7:58 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1692. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1692. 4 pillars. Lionel's spear danced in the wind, free and light. It didn't seem to have a shape or form, moving as it pleased and reacting even faster. Its tip was like a shadow, vanishing beneath the sunlight and reappearing in the least obvious of places. Its shaft was like a flood dragon, roaring through the air and dancing beneath the clouds. His skill in the spear was just the same as it had been before he entered the pagoda. The strength of his grandfather's comprehension was not small, and by grasping it, Lionel had already entered the elite ranks of spearmen. However, what wasn't the same was how his absolute spear domain flowed around him. It blanketed the surroundings, moving like a living, breathing entity as it followed the cadence of his spear. By this point, Lionel had gained an entirely new understanding of the absolute spear domain, and how it connected with his spear domain lineage factor. As this connection deepened, he also came to understand that the reason he hadn't been able to parse apart its true strengths was far more complex than he had originally thought. It wasn't just his method of battle that was holding him back, nor was it just his ability index. In addition to these two things, another large factor that held him back was actually a magic system that he had come to love a great deal. Camelot's magic system. A lot of the mechanisms of the spear domain lineage factor overlapped with Camelot's magic system, namely the latter's ability to control atmospheric force and make use of it. The root of the spear domain lineage factor was in controlled range. Everything within Lionel's absolute spear domain could be considered to be an extension of his body, from sensory organs down to even force itself. Within the barriers of the absolute spear domain, the flow of force was absolutely clear, and it could be taken to give strength to the spear wielder. This helped bolster the strength of the spear, range and leverage. However, Lionel's mage core gave him a very similar feeling, albeit slightly different. Due to his mage core being far more powerful due to the neglect of his spear domain lineage factor, in addition to the other mentioned factors, the feeling was far too subtle even for him to pick up on. So was that all? Case closed? Not exactly, because much like the Bao domain lineage factor had building blocks that seemed useless to the current Lionel at the moment, so too did the spear domain lineage factor. However, now that Lionel knew where the foundation lay and what it might build up to, seeing through the true strength of the spear domain lineage factor was much easier, so that was exactly what he did. After he found the first thread, he began to pull, losing himself in an endless, bloody battle that stretched on from hours to days. He was seemingly relentless in his pursuit of the end of this thread, and that was when the first bits and pieces began to make themselves known. Lionel learned that the so-called foundation of his spear domain lineage factor, which he had thought was the physical characteristics that allowed him to use the spear, was actually not the foundation at all. In fact, if he was correct, if he ever gained the full Bao domain lineage factor, he would experience similar physical changes that would instead help him to use the Bao. This wrong conclusion had caused him to make the incorrect assumption, shielding him from the true abilities of the lineage factor. If there was a first reward for him to gain in this pagoda, a reward he could have been given if not for the fact he already had the lineage factor to begin with, it would be spear aura. This spear aura would allow Lionel to use his spear like he did internal sight, blanketing a very small area which allowed his spear to be omnipresent. When this was accepted, just how similar was this to the Bao domain lineage factor? Both improved the senses. One made his vision far sharper, and the other also gave him a replacement for internal sight. Likewise, what was the final reward for the Bao domain lineage factor? Wasn't it the ability to emit force at a location you gazed upon? Just like this, the final reward of this pagoda would likely be Lionel's absolute spear domain, which allowed him to directly manifest force outside of his body. From this perspective, the two lineage factors were like mirrors of one another, working similarly. The question, then, was what were the steps in between? Between spear aura and the final absolute spear domain. What were the building blocks that gave the lineage factor strength? And that was something that Lionel was able to finally grasp after 5 days of continuous fighting. To pressure, to redirect, to take, to attack. These were the 4 summarizing pillars of the spear domain lineage factor. To pressure. Within the absolute spear domain, All other forces were suffocated and stifled, falling under the rulership of Spear Force. To redirect. Within the absolute Spear domain, all force that managed to remain were restricted in their control. First forces lost their edge and docile forces didn't dare to move at all. To take. Within the absolute Spear domain, forces could be co-opted and stripped away, melding into the rotating Spear Force to strengthen it, or be used for a counterattack. Essentially, all forces could be stripped down and turned into Spear Force. To attack. Within the absolute Spear domain, the spear could appear anywhere. Much like the eyes of the Bow domain lineage factor could shrink space and manipulate the fringes of time, so too can a spear tip within the absolute Spear domain. Regardless of the situation, regardless of Lionel's position, regardless of the attack's position, so long as all related subjects were within the absolute Spear domain, the spear would find them. Lionel's aura suddenly flourished, his demeanor shifting and his dead spear trembling to life. A roar shot through the skies, the rattling of the Spear domain ring becoming omnipresent, as Lionel suddenly pierced forward. However, right at that moment, the general of the army appeared to his back, having finally found an opportunity to attack. PCHU. The general froze, his spear risen high into the air. Lionel didn't even look back, slowly retracting his spear as a bloody hole appeared between the general's brows. The wildness in Lionel's eyes faded, his breaths coming in deep, soothing heaves. From start to finish, he never turned to face the general. Chapter 1693. Published at 9th of March, 2023, 7:58 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1693. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1693 Theory. Lionel exhaled, stepping out of the spear pagoda. He looked back to find a familiar pillar of light reaching into the skies, but he wasn't surprised by this. He had realized a short way through the first floor that there was only one floor to be seen at all. His progress would be dependent on how many of the army that he had killed, but it turned out that he had killed them all. It just went to show just what kind of changes Lionel's body had undergone. Previously, his stamina would have long since been tapped out, especially with how wildly he had begun to battle near the end. The Spear faction was already in an uproar due to the shocking changes of the Spear pagoda, but when Lionel walked out, the shock was even more heavy. Truthfully, after clearing the Spear pagoda, he could enter the Spear faction for free from now on. But he didn't expect to be able to law-speak his way out of punishment. When one's elders wanted to be unreasonable, you could only acquiesce. It wasn't long before Lionel locked eyes with his aunt, prepared to run. But surprisingly enough, she didn't seem very eager to run after him. She simply stood there, legs spread and arms crossed, watching with a smile. Now he was the seventh to clear it, and the lights were actually extremely resplendent. But Lionel had actually entered at Tier 1, and faced that many enemies all on his own. It was truly shocking. There simply wasn't a precedent for such a thing. By this point, many stories had been traded and circulated about what many experienced in the zone. Some gained opportunities, but there were many more who lived lives of suffering. This was especially so since everyone reported being unable to use force or their ability indexes. For most, their journey came to an end just like this. They spent their days in humiliation, hoping and praying for a chance to escape. There were all sorts of stories. Some found valuable ruins, some located precious treasures, and some grasped valuable truths that would help them for decades into the future. There was something special that many noticed, though. Those who had world spirits were unlike the others, and had been able to use their force just fine. This was a truth that was found after plotting the patterns of everything that had happened. But this led to an interesting change. Due to this, it was very possible that these youths might even surpass the Cataclysm generation given time. What did this all mean? Essentially, as Ness looked toward Lionel, the more she felt that there might be some truth to this theory. Could it be that all of these youths had experienced the same thing? In that case, didn't that mean that there was a change coming very soon? Chapter 1694. Published at 9th of March, 2023, 7:58 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1694. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1694. Villain Lionel relaxed a bit seeing that his aunt wasn't ready and waiting to devour him. But he shivered when he felt another gaze boring into him. Ah, what a beauty! Ma'am, can you please tell me your name? I'll remember it for a lifetime and cherish your sweet voice for eternity. Lionel ran after her, peppering her with all the corny lines he could think of. Lionel grinned, sweeping her waist into his arm and ignoring her faux attempt at fighting back. As he saw it, this was a victory. He didn't seem to care about the gazes he was getting either. Hearing such a question, Lionel bent down and whispered into her ear. She thought it was serious, so she listened attentively at first, but the longer he went, the more red she seemed to become. However, even after she had become a ripe tomato, Lionel didn't seem to have any intention of finishing his list. Aina pushed him away with two hands, blushing profusely. She couldn't even repeat the things he had said. They were way too embarrassing. Lionel laughed. There's nothing to do until we get the rest of our void merits come the end of the month, and there's nothing of interest here to me outside of the void library. So unless you want to do something, we can just relax. Lionel shivered when he heard this voice, turning back to see his aunt. He could only smile sheepishly, trying to remain ingratiating. This woman was truly nothing short of a T-Rex in female form. If she wanted to, she could probably run in a straight line through the Void Palace and never turn or climb up. Nothing, whether building or natural landscape, would be able to stop her forward charge. In that case, you can start paying back what you owe the Spear faction. Don't start the nonsense with me. Although you can enter for free now, that doesn't change what you owed before. If you want to pay it back, you have to do some work, or else how will I maintain order around her? Good, much better than that disobedient father of yours. Now if you want to pay off your debt. However, as Lionel's thoughts were drifting aimlessly, what his aunt wanted to do drifted into his ears and caused his eyes to twitch. Off you go. Don't think of returning until you've done your task properly. You two little cubs want a baby make before me? Absolutely not. Lionel turned and vanished with a strong step. It was best he get out of here as fast as possible, so he wouldn't have to find out whether Aina's glare or his embarrassment would kill him first. Well, this could be considered to be their fault as well. After all, if they hadn't antagonized the Spear faction so much of these last few years and caused his aunt to be so unhappy, this wouldn't be happening either. So now, Lionel just had to uphold justice. There wasn't anything else for him to do. To most people Lionel passed by, he was nothing more than a blur, his speed reaching a level impossible to track for many sixth-dimensional students, especially not those that could only be considered to be galaxy rank. Maybe only sector-ranked disciples could hope to stand a chance. Hey! Lionel sighed again. Welp, here we go. Sword faction trash. Lionel's voice boomed, echoing again and again over the large mountains of the Void Palace. I've come to challenge you all. Chapter 1695. Published at 9th of March, 2023, 7:58 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1695. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1695. Stalwart Lionel's booming words traveled far and wide. So much so that many factions outside of the Sword faction heard his call. In fact, even the Spear faction which he had just left heard him. Of course, doing even that was highly arrogant, and it caused the fury of the Spear faction. But back then, the Sword faction had gained the upper hand, especially with the fall of the stalwart polearm party. The gap wasn't enormous, but between such strong existences, just small differences were able to tip the balance. After the return of the Morales family heirs, the situation had stabilized, but with the stalwart polearm party still having been downgraded to a faction and not having had the chance to return to their former glory, while the suppression had weakened, it hadn't outright vanished just yet. After the Seward family heirs and the Morales family heirs began entering the 7th dimension one after another, they became restricted by the rules of the Void Palace, and were limited in their ability to interfere in such things. In such a situation, unless First Nov quickly helped the stalwart polearm party return to the status of a party instead of the legacy faction they currently were, things would only get worse and worse. But not to mention the fact that returning to the status of a party was very difficult. Even if they did, Unless they could also return to being a majority leader, it would all be useless. Ultimately, this led to the situation as it was here. The spear faction was still being oppressed, and the sword faction was quickly becoming stronger and stronger. Now, the only path Ness saw was to send in her nephew to wreak some havoc. Lionel grinned, grabbing at the air and forming a spear out of emulation spatial force. The light didn't stop, suddenly rising into the air, and splitting even the sword faction's logo and sign in two. The members of the sword faction couldn't believe what they were seeing, so much so that their previous rage vanished into nothingness for a long while. But when it returned, it did so with a vengeance, roars of rage filling the surroundings. A small gust of wind kicked up the dust on the well-paved road, as the cries of several sword hums rose into the skies. Lionel's smile didn't fade, the tip of his spear dipping down slightly as he held it forward. Compared to the army he had just battled, these sword faction members seemed too small. Blood flew, limbs danced in the skies, and cries of agony replaced the ones of fury. Back up. He's from the Morales family. That's the absolute spear domain. Only those who have grasped at least part of the absolute sword domain should go forward. The quality of opponents Lionel faced suddenly changed. Swirls of sword and spear force shot into the air. There was no doubt that those who could touch onto the secrets of these domains were extraordinary. But without the full lineage factor, how could they stand up to him with this alone? He pierced forward again, causing 3 arms to spin into the air. In the distance, several powerful auras converged, their bodies looking like swords streaking across the skies. Chapter 1696. Published at 16th of March 2023, 6:04 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1696. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1696. Blazing Devil. Lionel's spear snaked through the skies, continuing to thrust forward as though he hadn't sensed the coming auras at all. The smile on his face was still there, beaming like a secondary ray of light. It was in stark contrast to the blood and cries that flew around him. From any perspective, he truly looked like a demon incarnate. Stop! The eyes of many of the sword faction that had dulled with despair suddenly lit up. Of the 3 approaching auras, 2 of them were very familiar, and were members of the Seward family. As for the last, although he wasn't a member of the Seward family, with how popular the sword was as a weapon, how could it be that only the Seward family would produce astounding talents? Regardless of which of the 3 it was, they had already surpassed Tier 6 of the 6th dimension. Both Seward family members had a firm grasp of the sword domain lineage factor, while the third of them had completed 70% of the sword pagoda. All 3 of them, while not being members of the Cataclysm generation, were individuals who had entered with the next generation, placing them with the likes of the youths Lionel had met at the Void Tower. And yet, even with all of this being the case, Lionel didn't seem to react to their call at all. His expression casual and unhurried. The 3 were immediately infuriated. None of them believed that Lionel hadn't heard them, which meant that he had purposely ignored them without a care. They had more reasons than just this to be infuriated as well. After all, the 3 of them had just been preparing to enter the sword pagoda just a moment ago, only to be interrupted by Lionel's arrogant roar. When they entered in range of the battle, and saw their fellow swordsmen and women being practically crippled one after another, their gazes went red, especially when they noticed that Lionel was actually using the absolute spear domain. To think that a member of the Morales family would actually come here so arrogantly. The 2 Seward family youths flashed forward without hesitation, flipping their palms over to expose radiant swords. The trio appeared just 10 meters from Lionel in the blink of an eye, all 3 of them launching all-out strikes from the very beginning without showing the slightest hint of mercy. They didn't even consider the rules of the Void Palace. If Lionel was truly crippled, or worse yet, died, that would be trouble they would deal with after the fact. However, just when their sword force was prepared to tear Lionel to pieces, his absolute spear domain trembled, pulsing once and shattering the sword lights into what looked like flecks of broken glass. With a step, Lionel's figure vanished and he appeared before the 3, his spear striking out just once, and yet all of suddenly felt as though their lives were in danger. Their pupils constricted, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood at attention as their hearts palpitated. Without hesitation, they all raised their swords to block. A strong force pushed against the three of them, causing them all to take heavy steps backward. A grave expression spread across their faces as they looked toward Lionel, with a hardly concealed wariness. The strength behind that blow was far too monstrous, and it was clear that his control over the absolute spear domain was at a ridiculous level. But worst of all, his personal strength was still more than enough to overwhelm them even after splitting it into three. The absolute spear domain was, indeed, able to attack multiple people at once, but the drawback was also dividing your attack strength by that many times as well. If this was taken to its logical conclusion, this person was more than 3 times more powerful than each one of them. Their heads shook furiously, unable to believe such a thing. Battle intent raged in their eyes, and they stomped the ground hard to stop their backward momentum. Brandishing their swords, they charged forward once again, their sword force radiating outward. The 2 seared family members both activated their absolute sword domains, but neither was satisfied with just this alone, a tinge of red lighting their eyes. Lionel raised an eyebrow. This aura, he recognized it. Back when he had defeated Amory relying on the white lion bow, his gaze and aura had both turned quite dark. With Lionel's sharp senses, he could tell that Amory was being forced to hold something back. Of course, he still didn't know that Amory had been preparing for his sword domain tribulation back then, and in order to suppress it and wait for an optimal time, he chose to seal away much of his strength to keep the ring from erupting ahead of time. That said, as threatening as Amory was back then when he almost lost control, these 3 were like pitiful toddlers in comparison. Lionel only felt that it felt somewhat familiar. In that case, this should be the lineage factor of the Seared family. They should be the only other family outside of the Morales who have 2 lineage factors to their bloodline. But everyone in the Morales family who can awaken both is an heir candidate. Could it be that these 2 are also heir candidates? What Lionel didn't know was that the Seared family lineage factor worked differently. Much like most lineage factors, their main lineage factor, or the equivalent of the Morales family's metal synergy lineage factor, could be awakened in degrees. The difference was that in the Seared family, the degree to which it was awakened was decided at birth and couldn't be steadily awakened like Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor. As a result, everyone in the Seared family had awakened this lineage factor to a certain degree, the Blazing Devil lineage factor. The 2 Seared family members howled into the air, a wild and savage aura coming off from them that turned their sword force a tinge of crimson. Lionel's gaze flashed. Okay, show me what you've got. Chapter 1697. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:04 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1697. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1697. Thanks the 2 shot forward. As for the 3rd non-seared family member, he seemed to know his limits and stayed behind. At least that's what it seemed like at first. But what happened afterward seemed to change that narrative entirely. The 3rd swordsman tossed his sword into the air. One after another, swords began to appear in the air, a surging aura coating around them as they zipped about in a controlled formation. Lionel's eyes flashed with a hidden light. It looked like a telekinesis ability index, but not at the same time. It was just slightly different. This 3rd individual was from the Sina family. They were a family of swordsmen as well, but they were a tier below the likes of the Morales and Seared family, and could be considered to be on par with the weaker Constellation families. Their lineage factor was unique in that they likewise as a sword-related lineage factor, but theirs was a unique sword force and soul force fusion that allowed them to manipulate swords in particular. This lineage factor allowed them to form formations of swords, and made them quite good at battling large numbers of opponents or restraining opponents with area control. When you fused the kinetic sword lineage factor with the sword domain lineage factor, you gained a powerful stacking effect that probably made this 3rd swordsman the strongest of the trio. Lionel's brows couldn't help but raise with a hint of surprise as he tapped the ground with his foot, retreated for a moment and parried the 2 Seared family members with a single thrust. Lionel found his wrist vibrating slightly at the impact. Oh, the strikes were far more powerful than he had anticipated. Another drawback of splitting his attack was the effect of doubling the rebound. After all, he was facing 2 strikes at once and not just a single one. He wasn't sure what kind of changes these lineage factors caused, but after just a single exchange, he realized that it boosted not only their speed a great deal, but their strength more than doubled in a single instant as well. As Lionel was thinking, the formation of swords had already surrounded him, and he couldn't help but probe it with his internal sight. He found it fascinating because there seemed to be a unique cadence to the way the swords moved, as though they were in resonance with one another. It was definitely beyond just controlling each sword to move individually. It seemed to Lionel that there was a unique tether between them. The movement of one followed the movement of them, all like the ring of a chime. Lionel saw through this in a single glance because it reminded him of something even more profound. Force arts. So this is possible as well. Lionel's first instinct was to try and replicate it. Even fighting such a battle, being hounded from the front by 2 seemingly rabid-seared family members, and from the sides and back by this formation, he still had more than enough mental capacity to spread around. He parried and defended, gliding backward with every collision, but to the ignorant, it only looked like he was being forward to retreat again and again, causing the members of the sword faction to cheer their seniors on. Within Lionel's dream world, he formed several spears and controlled them. With his variant earth force affinity, taking control of metal objects was easy. So theoretically, wasn't it also possibly for him to replicate the feat of the Cena family member? Unfortunately, he quickly found that this was impossible, and why wouldn't it be? The uniqueness of the method lied in the combination use of soul force. The assimilation abilities of the spear domain lineage factor could potentially do this. After all, it was designed to absorb forces and assimilate them. This was something that Lionel AHD learned long before he even stepped into the spear pagoda. It was just that he had always assumed that it could only be done with his own force. But doing things this way also felt off. That was when Lionel realized the problem. It wasn't just that soul force was needed, but the method by which it was used as well. Essentially, he needed the unique force art methods of the Cena family, a language that he had never learned before. Fascinating. Lionel's vision cleared somewhat in the real world. When he looked around, he was about to be forced out of the sword faction again, but the smile on his face only grew brighter. All this time, he had known exactly how to improve his grandfather's way of the spear. The first step was resonating with calligraphy and words, the second was resonating with music and sound, and the last was resonating with painting and visualization. If he wanted to take it beyond this, Lionel had always believed that the answer lay with force arts, but he didn't know how he would do it. He had yet to walk forward because he lacked a method. Who would have thought that he would find this method on his first day on the job as a villain? It seemed that crime really did pay. The Cena family had suddenly opened a door for him. The key that he needed was right before him. Now that he knew such a method existed, it was only a matter of time before he built his own. Lionel's bright smile caught the 3 off guard, but they didn't waver in the slightest. Despite this, they couldn't help but be shocked by the words he spoke next. "Thanks." Lionel grinned. At that moment, a bronze aura radiated out from Lionel, a halo taking shape above his head. He pierced forward, his spear seemingly splitting into 2 and colliding against the swords of the 2 seared family members. They tried to fight back, but Lionel, who they had been beating back before, suddenly became like an endless abyss. No matter how much strength they put in, it seemed to sink into an unknown depth, never to return again. They held on for just a moment before they were sent flying backward. Chapter 1698. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:04 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1698. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1698. Storms. The smiles on the faces of the sword faction members froze as Lionel took another casual step forward. With a wave of his hand, several bubbles appeared in the air, encasing the swords flying about the surroundings and locking them in space. This was precisely what emulation spatial force was best at. He might be limited in his ability to use it to move since his comprehension of it was too low, but when it came to stacking and locking space, it truly earned its right as a top 5 spatial force in all of existence. With another step, ethereal star force wrapped around Lionel's body, his speed skyrocketing as he appeared before the Cena family member. His spear pierced forward. Its tip was so small, and yet the momentum behind it felt like a raging tsunami. Just looking at it, the heart of the Cena family member rose and fell in waves, his head snapping from left to right only to find the two seared family members flying by his sides, unable to stop themselves. He roared, taking out another sword and swinging out with all the might that he could muster. But before he could even finish his strike, the aura of Lionel's absolute spear domain shredded his accumulating force to pieces, assimilating his sword force and making the rushing tsunami grow all the taller. The Cena family member was sent flying into the distance before Lionel's spear even landed, his bones being crushed beneath the pressure as though he was facing a demon general. He crashed along the ground, the whites of his eyes rolling forward as he began to foam at the mouth. It was hard to tell if he would ever have the capacity to battle again. Lionel's spear aura continued to wash forward, wreaking havoc everywhere it went and shredding the attempts to block it into pieces. It crushed everything in its path, catching up to the flying seared family members and ravaging the both. Lionel came to a stop, clicking his tongue slightly as he retracted the rest of his strike. It seemed that he had gotten a bit overly excited and used a bit too much strength. With the current state of his sword force, whenever he unleashed too much of it, he wouldn't even have to strike down most people. Most so-called geniuses would just directly crumble. Lionel had a feeling that this was a result of high-level force manipulation, a direct suppression that truly represented a gap between dimensions. In the most literal sense, a person who was a dimension above you should be infinitely more powerful. No matter how powerful he was in the sixth dimension, he should never be able to face someone in the seventh dimension. However, in practice, at least until now, he had never experienced such a gap. Not until at least he had entered that zone. But in that zone the true gap lay not in dimensions, but in degree of force manipulation. The Blue Cobra demon had been able to toy with him like a ragdoll precisely because of this gap. While Lionel had yet to figure out how to progress his other forces reliably, his grandfather had already done the work for him when it came to the spear, so it wasn't a surprise that his current spear force was so absolutely suffocating. If it wasn't for the fact he had gotten a bit excited knowing how to progress his spear force from now on, he wouldn't have displayed so much of it. If he was too unrestrained, he might truly accidentally kill someone. Lionel looked around and chuckled slightly. Even those that hadn't been wrapped up in his spear aura and escaped injuries had mostly fainted. Those that managed to retain their consciousness had all fallen to the ground. If one came to look now without knowing what had happened, they would have never guessed that this was actually the famous sword faction. Lionel looked around as though trying to see if there was anyone else, but after a while, no one stepped forward, so he could only shrug. It seemed that the truly powerful members of the sword faction were busy today. Lucky him. That meant that his job would end early. Now he could rush back to his Aina. Whistling a small tune, Lionel crushed his emulation spatial force spear and began to casually walk away. He paused for a moment when he remembered that he had kept the Cena family members' swords locked in place. With a thought, he released them and caught one in his hands before nodding to himself. There wasn't anything special about the swords aside from being a bit lighter than normal. Even though their construction was fairly ordinary, it was truly the force and the secrets behind their manipulation that made them so powerful. Lionel's eyes sharpened, zooming into a section of the blade just before the hilt. There was a mark there so faint that if not for his gaining the pieces of the Bao domain lineage factor, he would have never seen it. Right there were the faint etchings of what looked like delicate calligraphy. Lionel tossed the sword away and grasped at another one, then another. Each time he finished, he nodded to himself. All of the swords had this brand. One could have easily mistaken it for the signature of a craftsman, if it wasn't for the fact that they were all just the slightest bit different. If I incorporate this into that, yes, the results would be excellent. Lionel slotted this into the back of his mind before tossing the swords aside and walking awake. In his wake, the groans of swordsmen and women echoed through the faction. In the distance, the seventh-dimensional overseers of the sword faction could only clench their fists, unable to do anything. As for Cornelius, who was still following in the skies, he had already rubbed a few layers of skin from his forehead. This child would truly be the end of him. He had just returned. Why was he already in the center of so many storms? This would definitely not end so simply. Chapter 1699. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:04 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1699. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1699 Waves. And sorry everyone, have a splitting headache right now, so I only managed to squeeze out 2 chapters. It felt like every time Lionel did something new, the information brokers of the Void Palace would try their best to keep a rein on the information. After all, this was how they made money. How could they not do such a thing? However, it was slowly becoming impossible to continue to do this. From the Void Tower, to the Bow Pagoda, then to the Spear Pagoda, and then to the Sword Faction. Every step Lionel took through the Void Palace only caused more and more waves. Soon, the number of individuals who had heard of things that happened began to overlap, and quickly news began to disseminate. First it was the results of Lionel's climb up the Void Tower. This was one of the most difficult things to hide because of the news names of the ranking list, and it was especially difficult because the names used were simply too shocking. The name Morales was one that echoed loudly through the human domain. In fact, as one of the strongest forces of the humans, it was likewise a name many of the other races were well aware of as well. The moment the name Lionel Morales was seen on the leaderboards, the forgotten Seventh Nova anchored his place in the minds of many who had long since forgotten him. However, this was just the very beginning. In fact, it could be said that Lionel's name wasn't actually the most shocking one to be seen on that list because in the near quarter century, he and Aina had disappeared for. The names of the prominent families of Earth had likewise come into the public consciousness. The name Brazinger carried with it an all-new connotation, a sort of weight that could very well increase to the point it stood next to the greatest families of the human domain, or at the very least, that was the way those of the human domain saw it. Not many knew that Lionel was of Earth, and that he shared a lineage with its current emperor. But now that everyone knew that his woman was actually a member of this new and shocking family, it caused an uproar in its own right. Those that had been fighting against Lionel that day were so distracted by him and his results that they hadn't even registered the fact that Aina was, in fact, a Brazinger. Due to this, the wave of shock toward Lionel lessened for a bit in some regards and increased in others. A lot of things suddenly made sense. Aina was an exceptional talent, one that would most definitely have long since claimed a spot on the Queen Beauty rankings already had she not disappeared for so long. But she had also seemingly come out of nowhere. The Void Palace was a place where everyone could come so long as certain standards were met, so Aina's background had never been important. After all, let alone Aina, the Void Palace had even admitted some non-humans in the past and present, although they were in a very small minority. Now though it all seemed to make sense. Could it be that the Morales family had had a stake in Earth long ago? This seemed like a very simple question, but the weight behind its answer couldn't be underestimated. Earth had been a taboo for a very long time because it could very well be the center of another all-out war within the human domain, something that couldn't be allowed to happen with danger lurking over the horizon. If, though, the Morales family had made such a bet in the past, this could spark another conflict. It had to be remembered that even with the Camelot Zone being tampered with in the past, it was done extremely covertly. In fact, just for that matter, in order to silence Lionel, the latter had almost suffered the punishment of death. If it hadn't been for his grandfather taking action back then and crushing the opposition, Lionel would likely be dead already. This matter was clearly not a simple one at all, and it was news that was capable of causing a tsunami of waves through the Void Palace. But before that wave could even settle, the matters began to pile up one after another. First it was the battle with Conan. With news of the Void Tower spreading, how could news of this not spread as well? The idea that the invincible armor of the Cataclysm generation was coming crashing down was enough to leave many in stunned shock until a simple fact was remembered. Wasn't Lionel, too, a member of the Cataclysm generation? In fact, not only was he a member, he was one of the only 3 to gain Amethyst token rights when the selection had come to an end. And of the other 2, one was the sword deity and the other was actually his girlfriend. News that the battle between Lionel and Conan was not only won by the former, but easily at that, was a shocking revelation that most still weren't willing to accept despite this truth. However, even this dust wouldn't settle before news of a man clearing the 12th floor of the Bao Pagoda was spread, and it only made it more polarizing that this man was banned from entering the archery faction for the next 10 years right after for nearly crippling a member of the Terrius family. All of this came to a head when it was learned that this was once again a feat of Lionel, shocking to an extreme and enough to leave people in complete and utter silence. Unfortunately, the news that day was truly relentless. Right after, news of the Spear faction's Spear Pagoda being cleared to perfection spread like wildfire, but it didn't even have time to calm before the so-called massacre of the Sword faction fell. An unsettling sort of silence fell over the Void Palace, but the man in question was taking a nice nap. Since he was unable to find Aina, he couldn't be bothered to do much other than wait for his Void points and make a final trip to the Void Library. Everything else was meaningless to him. As for the reactions of the Void Palace, though it would probably mean something later, he still couldn't be bothered to give it much thought. Chapter 1700. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:04 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1700. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1700. Center of the storm. Lionel got up with a yawn. With a quick flicker of his eyes, he could tell exactly how long had passed, and felt that it was about time he made his way to the Void Library. With a thought, he appeared outside of the segmented cube and took a step, quickly heading in that direction. Not too long later, he was standing before a familiar flight of steps, one that it had taken him a great deal of effort to climb when last he was here. Lionel smiled lightly, thinking about that moment. Because he only had 24 hours back then, he was in a great rush, so he had gone right from the stairs to the library, even wasting an instant recovery, so that he would be in the best shape possible, so that he could minimize the time he wasted. Now, however, Lionel didn't think that so much was necessary. These stairs that had been daunting before felt so very normal to him now. With a step, he vanished, leaping hundreds of stairs at once as he blazed a path upward, leaving many who were still climbing in his dust. Even as he moved, his speed only seemed to become faster and faster. By the time he looked up, he could already see the shadow of the library, the smile on his face widening. Lionel stomped his foot hard when he next contacted the ground, propelling himself upward with a wind-tearing momentum. Bang! He landed heavily at the top of the stairs, several glances landing on him all at once. Lionel knew that many of these people were domain-ranked disciples, a silent herd of individuals he could only see in very rare places like this one. They were truly mysterious. The last time he was here, even he couldn't quite feel their true strength. But now he was absolutely certain that they had enough power to crush him with a finger. That said, that could only be expected. It was impossible to be a domain-ranked disciple without first being a seventh-dimensional existence, but even then, that wasn't enough. It also required a certain amount of talent as well, much like the other ranks. Of course, just stepping into the seventh dimension alone was a testament to one's talent. The sixth dimension could be considered to be a huge watershed, even more so if you were following the God path. If one had enough time, they could brute force their way into the fifth dimension. But entering the sixth required a certain level of personal achievement, something that placed you far above the masses. The seventh dimension was an even more exaggerated version of this, leaving it as a watershed reserved for only the cream of the crop of an already small population. But these domain-ranked disciples were even a step above that. It was no wonder it was so difficult for the past Lionel to see through them. Still, Lionel just smiled lightly and stepped toward the library's doors before he entered a familiar world of darkness. All around him, the bits and pieces of the network that he had already formulated lay untouched. Lionel took a breath and he sunk into a state of meditation, spreading his starry spirit domain outward. Over these last few days of sleep, he had allowed his mind to adjust to its most ultimate state, but he had also considered other things quite thoroughly. There seemed to be a very special connection between the best resources of the Void Palace. Whether it was the pagodas, the Void Tower, or the Void Library, all of them had a very thin thread connecting them all. Dreamforce. It wasn't too obvious at first, but Lionel felt that there had to be a reason for all of this. And he felt that it was even more obvious when it was considered that the only place he ever saw domain-ranked disciples was in this very place. If the domain-ranked disciples knew of Lionel's thoughts, they would be quite shocked. This was because the reason for these matters was only made known to them after they reached their current disciple rank. Before that, they were in the dark like everyone else. Lionel also hadn't forgotten his shocking realization about zones and how their very being seemed to be formed of dream force as well, to the point where he was even able to use his affinity to find secrets within it. However, all of these bits and pieces of information led him nowhere. He didn't have an answer for it all, and he could only sit in idle curiosity, unless, that is, he could find a potential answer here. Lionel knew that he was running out of time in the Void Palace. Those lurking enemies of his in the darkness might have let him stay for a bit longer if he was weaker or more low profile, but they would soon realize that the more time he was given, the more difficult it would be for them to do what they wanted to do. In that case, this meant that Lionel would only have one go at this, one final stretch within the Void Library, one final chance to learn everything it had to offer. Lionel's eyes snapped open, his force rushing out like a tsunami. One after another, floating motes of light rushed toward him in batches of dozens at a time. Unlike the previous time where he biased it with spatial force research, this time, he didn't discriminate against anything. Today, no matter how many times he had to use instant recovery, he would do it. He really wanted to see who would give in first, himself or the Void Library. As Lionel's battle was beginning, the machinations that he was certain would unfold had indeed begun to, but the location where they began would be a surprise even to him, albeit quite a small one. That was because the center of the coming storm would begin in a place he was quite familiar with. The very same information network he had paid twice for information on Triana. This was none other than the Winding Shadow faction, now known as the Winding Shadow Legacy faction, run by none other than Ronan Sith. Chapter 1701, published at 16th of March, 2023. 6:04 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1701. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1701. Surefire motes of light quickly revolved around Lionel, their speed increasing with every passing instant. He seemed to have already lost himself in the movements, completely uncaring of the kind of stamina he was blowing through every moment. There had probably been very few in the history of the Void Palace who had completely assimilated all of the knowledge that was here, and probably none who would do so in a mere 2 visits like Lionel, and the difficulty easily spoke to that. However, even so, the experience was incredibly rewarding. After Lionel had assimilated all of the fourth-dimensional information in the Void Library, he had finally gone from an ignorant boy to someone who could be considered to have firmly stepped into the dimensional verse. Although there were still some simple matters that he didn't quite grasp, they were so insignificant that they didn't mean much on a large scale. Now, however, Lionel was quickly not only becoming well-informed, but he was even becoming more informed than most. It was like the difference between an individual finishing grade school and someone who had worked their way up to a doctorate, but the main distinction here was that rather than having this doctorate in just one field, Leon was quickly gaining them in everything. Studies and research papers on spatial force were just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, it could be said that they were among the rarest research conducted purely because of how rare spatial force was. There were more research papers on niche elemental forces than there was for spatial force on the whole. When entire elemental chains were taken into consideration, the difference was even more jarring, but the findings were equally as fascinating, although it was impossible that they would all be as useful as the Lotus research paper Lionel had read before that allowed him to form his Lotus domain. However, there were still quite a few that were interesting. For example, when it came to fire force, there were quite a few papers on chain reactions, and using them to make your fire force not only more powerful and sustained, but also more erratic and unpredictable. There were numerous applications just for this one path of study, everything from long-ranged attacks to sudden burst movements to even increasing the power of a strike in random intervals to catch an enemy off guard. But that was just fire force, and it was just a single potential path of growth. On the other side, there was water force. One of its interesting paths was actually very much related to resonance and its usage. There was a research paper that focused on using water force like a wine glass, and any attack like a sound wave. Once this was achieved, you could either choose to continue to trap the attack, then truly go the full extent, and allow your water force to shatter, repelling the strength and even using it against an enemy. The number of paths was too numerous to count, and the number of research papers was even greater. It made a reality set in for Lionel. Weren't all these things just different forms of force manipulation? Then what was truly the difference here? Was it that the people of the zone started honing in on these matters much earlier? Was it that this path was simply incorrect? Or was it something that he was missing? Lionel couldn't help but wonder about these things, comparing and contrasting the research papers here to what he had seen in the zone. After doing this, it wasn't long before he came to a fundamental difference. Although these research papers were great, and could even increase the strength of a force while it was in use, it was ultimately not fundamentally changing anything. The foundation of the force was still the very same foundation. If Lionel had to make a comparison, it was akin to a person who was weak of body being incredibly skilled in martial arts. Yet they would be able to display great strength, but how much of it would be maximized if they were also malnourished or half dead? However, Lionel still felt that this comparison wasn't quite perfect. The people of the zone didn't use all of these weird force application methods. For example, that youth with a high spatial affinity Lionel had met before Thela was completely caught off guard by the use of his lotus. It felt like there were two completely different paths, one of which was clearly more powerful than the other, at least on the surface. Is it that it's more powerful? Or is that this method of force manipulation is still in its fledgling state? Just look at how many research papers there are here, and how many of them test the very same thing just in slightly different ways. The history of the Void Palace is about 500,000 years from my understanding, but just from a casual look through the Olidark family's library I was able to see that the history of that zone is easily 100 times that. And that's just from the perspective of one of its weaker families. Who knows how much those much stronger families and organizations can see back? If you look at things like this, the human domain just hasn't had enough time to truly flesh out this method of force manipulation. But Lionel was a bit hesitant to just accept this with open arms. The reason was that it was too difficult to tell what the end of the road had for this path. While it could potentially match the road the zone had taken in the future, there was no guarantee. However, on the other hand, it wasn't as though Lionel had a surefire method waiting for him on the other side either. Even if he started down this more vetted path, there was nothing to assure him that he was even taking the right steps. Chapter 1702. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:04 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1702. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1702. Omen Lionel didn't force himself to make a decision, still focused on assimilating more. However, part of his mind still wanted to feel like he was headed in the right direction, so he allotted some of his thoughts to organize this information slowly. Ultimately, the main difference between the two paths was that one was focused on physical manifestations of change while the other was more focused on ethereal manifestations. Wait, Lionel had quite a real-world example of this, did he not? His grandfather's step-by-step progression from calligraphy to painting, which category did it fall into? Was it physical or ethereal? There was no fundamental change to the way Lionel utilized his spear force. It was fundamentally a change that occurred on the ethereal level, changing the artistic conception that breathed power into his spear. That was that, case closed, right? But when looked at from a different angle, it was also a physical change. After all, Lionel was consciously manipulating his spear force with the use of his dream class technique to form a different demeanor, by which he could project a powerful artistic conception. Due to this, he had found it difficult even to properly use his spear domain lineage factor as it required a more ethereal comprehension. On its face, this was clearly a contradiction. But maybe that was because his way of framing it was wrong from the very beginning. Although the manifestation was ethereal, didn't it have a physical presence? Weren't the changes that happened ethereally used to catalyze real-world changes? So no, the difference here couldn't possibly be a matter of physical and ethereal. It was deeper than that. Lionel felt that he was on the cusp of understanding something, but it was too profound for him to quite grasp. Even as he tore through the research papers, he still couldn't quite find his answer. For the first time, he felt that his intelligence actually wasn't high enough, and it was quite frustrating. In truth, Lionel was being too hard on himself. Enlightenment wasn't meant to come in endless waves, and even when they did, there would be peaks and valleys. These were things meant to be researched over the course of a lifetime, not just grasped in a single day. But Lionel just kept pushing. He didn't want to understand it all at once. What he wanted was a spark, a single ignition that would light the small fire he would protect until it became a raging inferno. So he turned to an ability he had relied on for years, his dreamscape. Lionel created his dreamscape, ironically, within a library as well, although it was very different from this one. That library had been Camelot's library. The purpose of the ability was to act as a sort of network of miniature brains in Lionel's mind. In everyday life, no matter what he came across, or how small the detail, he would subconsciously arrange it into one of his dreamscapes by category. By now, Lionel had millions of tiny dreamscape in his dream world, each one with a different network of information and many of them with overlapping redundancies, but that was the point. Oftentimes, brains got distracted, they forgot important details, or took into consideration useless details. Even for someone as smart as Lionel, he was fallible and could make mistakes. But that was where his dreamscape came in. Each one was like a uniquely designed software for a very specific task, and as such, whenever a link was made in one of them, a spark would light and Lionel would immediately be alerted. This time, as he built a new dreamscape, Lionel stripped down all the useless jargon and only built it up with what he needed the absolute most. There were scenes of Thiela's force manipulation, of the Cobra demons, even of Mistress Olidark's. On top of that, he added bits and pieces of the most interesting research papers he had read, some of which he planned to incorporate himself, and others of which he only wanted to use for reference as he felt he had better ideas on how to apply them elsewhere. The hours passed and Lionel's speed of assimilating his network only seemed to increase. What he didn't know was that after the first 24 hours passed, there was a sudden change. Outside of the Void Library there was an inconspicuous board that was easy to miss. It too was filed with names. However, this board was easily ignored because there were hardly ever changes to it, nor was there any movement. This board was a leaderboard, but it was maybe the most unique leaderboard of Void Tower because no one quite understood what it was for. All anyone knew was that there was a name match with a number. The higher the number, the higher the name. First place Cynthia Omen 83. 29. This first place name had remained undisturbed for decades. In fact, this individual was no longer even a domain-ranked disciple of the Void Palace. No, instead, they were the members of the only other family that could hope to stand against the Morales and the Seward family without the backing of an alliance. However, despite this being so, this family was still the head of maybe the strongest alliance there was in the human domain. The Omen family, or as most would recognize them as, the head of the Force Crafting Guild Alliance. As for the number 83, 29, it wasn't a normal number at all. Rather, it was actually a percentage. As for what it represented, it was the percentage of the Void Library integrated into her network. Of course, this Cynthia Omen had another famous title, and that was as the woman who should have been the wife to Velasco Morales, or as many called her, the scorned Queen Beauty. There were just 100 names on this unchangeable list, but at that moment, there was a change at the 100th spot. 100th place, Lionel Morales, 21. 38. Chapter 1703. Published at 16th of March, 2023. 6:04 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1703. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1703. 100%. The sudden change to the list, despite the fact it was rarely paid attention on the whole, was enough for all of the domain-ranked disciples to look at once. In that instant, the Void Library went from a quiet ambience to suddenly being forced to withstand a rushing wind. Their gazes sharpened, focusing on the name. When they saw the name Morales, their brows couldn't help but shoot up. There were 4 other Morales family members on the list, But this wasn't too surprising. The Morales family was the only crafting power capable of competing against the Force Crafting Guild in terms of quality of materials output, although they had no way of keeping up with quantity. With the design of the Void Library, those with greater mental properties would perform better. As such, it wasn't too surprising that the Morales family would have such a showing. However, what shocked them was that they didn't recognize this Lionel Morales name. If the disciples below were detached from Lionel's legend, at least in the beginning, then the domain-ranked disciples were even more so. They were disconnected from the world, and only really paid attention to their improvement. If there was anyone or any group that they did know about, it was most definitely the seventh-dimensional individuals of the Void Palace, as they were the only ones with a chance to one day become domain-ranked disciples. But what was shocking was that they didn't know this young man, so logically this could only mean that Lionel wasn't in the seventh dimension. Such a realization made their hearts skip a beat. This had to be a rare genius, but to think that this would actually happen twice. That was because right now the second-ranked individual on the list was another great anomaly second place. Yuri Brazing. 81. 87. Not only were the two top places women, but both happened to be two women who hated Lionel's guts. The first wasn't his fault, as that could only be blamed on his father's crimes. But as the saying went, like father, like son. Lionel had crimes of his own, cries that Yuri was very much aware of. When Yuri appeared on the scene to enter the Void Library, it was said that she managed to reach such a level of completion after just a single visit. But after this first visit, she turned around and left, never to return again. Others might be unaware of why this was, but the domain-ranked disciples weren't so ignorant. It was said that this Yuri wasn't human. As such, it was tacitly agreed that she wouldn't assimilate the knowledge of the Void Library fully, and it had just been a simple exercise on her part. As for what the details of this were, it was completely unknown. But what was clear was that there was actually a second individual who would cause the list to change in such a short period of time. Was it that youth who had just come up before? But that was impossible, he was just in Tier 1. Was such a thing even possible? Wait, how long had even passed since then? Even if he was 100 times more powerful, had enough time passed? As they were lost in thought, the numbers by Lionel's name only continued to shoot upward. While it was only 0.1% every few seconds to minutes, a slow speed for practically anything else, for the Void Library he might as well have been moving at light speed. The domain-ranked disciples watched in a stunned silence as Lionel crossed the 22% mark, and increased toward 23% and surpassed 24%. It took hours just to complete this, and yet the gazes of the domain-ranked disciples never moved away, as though they would never tire of watching this. The concept of time, or more accurately, how experts experience time once they reached a certain stage, was astronomically different from others. During their practice, they gained patience that most couldn't fathom. To them this was nothing. Even if it took days, they would be willing and able. And that it did. Their hearts shuddered with every step forward Lionel took. At some point, they began to look between the doors of the Void Library back to the leaderboard, seemingly waiting for Lionel to finally come stumbling out. Even for them, it took a great deal of effort just to last a few hours. So why did this sixth-dimensional junior not seem to have such limitations? From 100th place to 90th. From 90th to 80th. From 80th to 70th. Every step forward was egregiously slow. But they were steady and unmoved by the monotony. Within the Void Library, Lionel had no idea what was happening outside, but what he did know was that he was inching closer with every moment. As his horizons broadened, how he saw things also began to evolve. However, there was a very important key missing here. No matter how difficult it was to assimilate the information of the Void Library, when you were given practically infinite time like the domain-ranked disciples, why was it that even the best had only reached 83%? Could it be that those that had reached 100% left the list? Or was there something else at play here? Unfortunately, Lionel hadn't paid much attention to the leaderboard in the first place, or else he would have long since noticed Yuri's name. As such, he wasn't in a state of mind where he even cared about such things. He was entirely focused on reaching his goals. So when he finally did it, surpassing first place and rocketing upward to completion, He didn't give it a second thought until, red-eyed, he stepped out of the void library to find several eyes locked onto him. Lionel stood in silence, the fatigue making his brain foggy. He looked around with a raised brow, but no one seemed to have an answer for him. It wasn't long, though, before he spotted the leaderboard and his brows raised. Chapter 1704. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:04 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1704. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1704. Familiar. Lionel exhaled a breath before stretching his neck. Of course, he had no idea who Cynthia Oman was, but he most definitely recognized Yuri's name. It seemed that girl was doing just fine. That was good, since Aina would be sad if she had died in the zone. Lionel wondered if Yuri was still here, or if she had returned to Earth. Of course, he also had no idea that the Brazinger name also held much more weight now than it had before as well. If he had known, he would also know that returning probably wouldn't be very safe for Yuri. Lionel yawned. He had a bit of that good feeling of euphoria one had after a workout, but he also wanted to collapse into a heap after devouring a ton of food as well. It was about time he found Aina, whose cooking would be better to enjoy now than his girlfriend's. Lionel stretched and took a step toward the stairs to return. He expected someone to stop him because that was just the kind of luck he had. But surprisingly, no one did. Everything felt quite eerily silent, and no one said a word as Lionel vanished down the steps. That didn't stop their brows from being touched with a hint of solemnity. Lionel made it down to the bottom of the stairs quite quickly. His eyes were somewhat droopy and he yawned from time to time, but ultimately, his state was still far better now than it had been in the past, where he could barely move. A while later, he returned to the Spear faction, and nothing much seemed to have changed. He had half expected for a war to have broken out by now, but once again, his expectations were dashed. It was, once again, oddly peaceful. Lionel was very used to this. In reality, it was just about an hour of peace, but it felt off as though he didn't deserve this much. He couldn't help but chuckle to himself. He really never got much time to rest. The last time he did was thanks to his mother twisting the rules of the Void Palace for his sake, but that almost resulted in a disaster because they were dumped right into the selection right after. Lionel sighed. Was his mother all right? He hoped so. He wondered if she knew that he was back or not. He would have gone to see her, but he simply didn't know where to go and look for her. By now, she was probably also a domain-ranked disciple, so it was even more difficult now than it had been in the past. Or, as the Princess of Earth, she had probably returned to help hold down the line. Lionel wasn't too obsessed with seeing his mother. With his personality, so long as he knew his loved ones cared for him, that was enough. He didn't feel the need to see them all the time, nor did he need their constant affirmation. If he did, he would have hated his father's guts a long time ago, but instead, he was the man he respected most. Lionel walked into the Spear faction and spread out his internal sight in all directions. By this point, there were very few who could sense his internal sight if he didn't want them to, and if covertness was really what he wanted, he would just use a dialed-down version of his starry spirit domain. With a smile, Lionel headed in a certain direction. On the roof of a certain building, Aina and Ness were both having tea. It seemed that by now, the two were quite chummy. Though what machinations were hidden behind those smiles was hard to see through. On the surface, they were just two beauties chatting. But deep within, it was probably more accurate to call them a pair of demonesses. When Lionel appeared, the idle chit-chat and laughter vanished into the air, and they looked toward him together. Their eyes filled with a peculiar light that made him feel uneasy. Aina had vanished for a few days, and he still had no idea where she had gone. Now though, she seemed almost too in sync with Ness, as though the pair were two peas in a pod. If he wasn't so scared, he might find it amusing. After all, Aina had gotten so close with her aunt-in-law before she did so with her mother-in-law. Lionel cleared his throat to say something as the silence got heavier, but before he could, Ness spoke first. "Did you do the task I told you to?" Lionel blinked. "I did. I already attacked the Sword faction." Ness raised an eyebrow as though she didn't believe him. "Are you lying to me?" Lionel frowned. Why would he lie about something like that? But the fact Ness was asking seemed to imply something else. If you really attacked, then why are they so silent? Those arrogant swordsmen wouldn't take something like that lying down so easily. Boom. As though Ness' words were some sort of jinx, the ground suddenly quaked, the building they stood upon swaying wildly from side to side. Glass windows shattered into pieces that rained down like fine crystals, like the earth cracked and splintered, spreading out in cobweb-like patterns in every direction. Ha! Lionel's head turned in a certain direction. He had felt that Ness jinxed them for a moment, but that didn't feel like the something on the scale of what the sword faction could accomplish. At least not members of the sword faction that would be at the 6th dimension. But 7th-dimensional individuals wouldn't interfere in matters like this. Lionel's pupils constricted as he looked off into the distance, but when he saw what it was, his eyes couldn't help but widen. As though they had just stepped out of some sort of warp drive. 6 planet-sized ships appeared around the Void Palace, each one with a design that was eerily familiar to Lionel. Soon after, an eerily familiar decree also fell. Under the decree of Shield Cross Star, Leonidas Morales is to be classified as a Tier 2 fugitive, found guilty for the crime of colluding with a variant invalid. The fugitive has 2 hours to hand himself in, or his charges will be increased to Tier 1. The bounty is set to 10,000 kilograms of 7th-dimensional herb. Chapter 1705. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:04 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1705. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1705. Madman. The last time this happened, Lionel looked up into the skies with quite a helpless expression on his face. He had just battled the puppet master until he had not an ounce of strength left in his body, all to find out that friends he had made had lost their lives one after another in the face of Terrain's invasion. He had been exhausted, both physical and mentally. As a young man who had entered the dimensional verse at a mere 17 years of age, passing his 18th birthday in a Mayan tomb of all things, he hadn't gotten a chance to breathe not a single time. It just felt relentless, as though the world itself wouldn't calm until it reaped his life away. However, when he looked up into the skies this time, after his gaze settled and he understood what was happening, he actually chuckled. He found it all to be amusing, as though they had all set the table for an excellent comedy show designed just for him. He was no longer than 18-year-old youth. His 24th birthday had passed not long ago, and the strength he held in the palm of his hands was nothing like it had been in the past. He stood taller, his shoulders were broader, his stance more solid. He knew what he wanted in life, and things that used to make him wince in pain and shiver in terror no longer even made him blink. There was a point in his life where the greatest pain to him was simply opening up the first doors of his metal synergy lineage factor. But just a few weeks ago he had suffered a fate of being eaten alive, and actually managed to maintain his sanity. There was a point where he was ignorant of the ways of the dimensional verse, shocked and awed by the littlest of things, but now he held maybe more knowledge in his mind than even the Void Elders themselves. There was a point in his life where Shield Cross Stars was able to brand him as though he were a slave or cattle for them to mark. A point in his life where he could do nothing but sit in silent frustration, unable to do a single thing in response. But now he laughed. He laughed so hard that tears almost fell from his eyes, so hard that stomach cramped and his face went red. In a world that had fallen into silence after a booming command spread across the vastness of space, Lionel was seemingly the only one making any noise at all. Ness shifted her gaze away from the 6 planetary warships and looked toward the laughing figure of Lionel. She was speechless for a moment before she shook her head. Madmen, the whole lot of them, she muttered. At that moment, she seemed to forget that she too was a Morales. Not just one that had married into the family, but one who had been born a Morales and married a Morales. But even so, it was a common sentiment among the women of the family, an innocent sort of hypocrisy and a casual forgetfulness that while the men of the Morales family might all be mad, they also happened to be very obedient at home. Lionel wiped his tears and turned a gaze toward Aina. It seems that we have to leave a bit earlier than expected. The question is, do you want to do so quietly? Or wreak some havoc? A grin spread across Lionel's face. The last time Shield Cross Stars had chased him down, he used a javelin to destroy their warships. Of course, That was a mere branch of Shield Cross stars, as they had one in every galaxy across the human domain. Compared to that branch, the officers that had come this time were on a completely different level. If they weren't, how would they dare to come to the Void Palace with such a bold display? Surrounding Void Palace with warships? Were you trying to slap the faces of the protectors of mankind? However, if there was any organization that could do so, it was Shield Cross stars. The Void Palace was the protectors of humanity against the other races. Shield Cross stars was the protector of humanity against themselves. They were two sides of the same coin, connected in many ways, and disconnected in many more. Becoming a Tier 3 fugitive in the eyes of Shield Cross stars was enough to guarantee a life without peace. This level was a point where it ceased to be a matter of branches, and reached a level where the whole of Shield Cross stars would be focused on your capture. Yet Lionel wasn't just Tier 3, he was actually classified as Tier 2 with a clear route to Tier 1. There was no doubting the seriousness of this matter. Hearing Lionel's question, it was Aina's turn to be speechless. Wasn't leaving silently the obvious answer? This boyfriend of hers was getting more and more fond of causing trouble. But she couldn't help but feel a hint of excitement seeing the look in her eyes, the result of contradictory feelings pulling her in separate directions. On one hand, she wanted Lionel to be safe and stop taking risks. But on the other hand, she couldn't help but be supremely attracted to the Lionel she was seeing now. At that moment, before Aina could answer, a familiar figure appeared in the skies, a deep frown on his face. This man was none other than Cornelius, who had been assigned to follow and monitor Lionel. Right now, his usually helpless expression was taken over by a hardly concealed fury. Shield Cross stars, what is the meaning of this? What do you mean by surrounding my Void Palace? Have you forgotten all sense of propriety? Don't overstep your bounds. Cornelius didn't seem to be trying to speak very loudly, but his volume was no less oppressive and mighty than the voice of Shield Cross stars who had spoken previously. Chapter 1706. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:06 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1706. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1706. Mistaken. Cornelius' words echoed with a boom, stifling the echo of the previous man who had spoken. The fury in his tone was subtle, but still clear, the rumbling of his voice causing the 6 warships to quake. In response, the warship facing Cornelius had some movement, and a figure slowly made their way out. He wore the iconic uniform of Shield Cross stars, split robes and metallic leg sleeves. It made him look like an off-duty Knight of the Templar, the metal shimmering with a resplendent glow that seemed to warp the air with its heft. Cornelius' eyes narrowed when he saw this individual. He had already expected that whoever Shield Cross stars would send for such a mission would not be normal, but seeing it for himself helped it truly sink in. Much like their fugitive tiers, Shield Cross stars also had officer tiers. Anyone above Tier 4 was already in the 7th dimension, but this individual was already in Tier 2. Of course, on the surface and without further investigation, it made sense that anyone that came after a Tier 2 fugitive would likewise be a Tier 2 officer. But when it was considered that Lionel was a junior who had only just stepped into 6th dimension, this was absolutely ridiculous, especially since this was no normal Tier 2 officer. Within tiers of officer, there were what Shield Cross stars upper management called promotion paths. These promotion paths were further divided into Shield ranks and Star ranks, which were then even further divided into 3 levels each. Essentially, Shield ranks were the foot soldiers. They were the bulk of the force, and they were the units that did everything from manning the ships to doing maintenance on them. Star ranks were the commanding officers. These were individuals who gave and related orders, as well as those who had the strongest combat prowess of the organization. The so-called promotion path was decided by one's potential and talent. There were vast differences between those of the same dimension and even of the same tier. As such, every member of Shield Cross stars was evaluated strictly, and then slotted into their appropriate roles. The Tier 2 Shield rank officers tended to be individuals of the very pinnacle of the 6th dimension. The Tier 2 Star rank officers, however, were all in the 7th dimension without the slightest doubt. In fact, so were Tier 3 Star rank officers. Only Tier 1 Shield rank officers could finally be of the 7th dimension, So one could imagine the kind of monsters made up Tier 1 star rank officers. Knowing this, the fact a Tier 2 star rank officer had appeared here for the sake of capturing and bringing Lionel to justice. Well, to say it was overkill was an understatement. In fact, it smelt of bullshit. Level 3 Tier 2 star rank officer DiVincenzo. He stated his name and rank immediately. I've come for the fugitive. I hope that you will not make things difficult for me. Cornelius' expression darkened. I've asked once and I will ask once more. Do not make me repeat myself for a third time. What is the meaning of this? It almost felt that Shield Cross Stars was using this as an opportunity to knock the Void Palace down a peg, and Lionel was just a convenient excuse. But it was clear that there was something deeper than this. If Lionel was truly some sort of fugitive, there were a million other ways to deal with this situation. Announcing it to the world and coming forward so boldly was among the very stupidest. No, it might be the stupidest. Doing things like this ensured that there would be witnesses, and with witnesses, that man would catch wind of this. Cornelius understood Velasco well. If Lionel died in the hands of another six-dimensional existence, or for example, died in a trial that many of his other cohorts had survived like the Rapak's nest, he wouldn't care. However, if he died in the hands of some old monster, or in the midst of a power struggle designed purely to spit in the face of Velasco's legend, then there would be hell to pay. The Void Palace was still reeling from the last time Velasco attacked them in a fury. Compared to the Void Palace, Shield Cross Stars was even more vulnerable, because their power was separated across so many locations and branches. Did they have a death wish? None of this even considered the stance of the Morales family as a whole on the topic. As I've said, we have only come for the fugitive, there is no other meaning. You've come for a Tier 1 six-dimensional junior with 6 Tier 2 officer fleets? Cornelius sneered. Do you take me for a child? It is inadvisable to underestimate youth. We have intelligence that he could be a danger to his surroundings. With the future of the human domain being held here, taking risks would be unacceptable, so we came out with the full measure of strength possible to be allocated to a Tier 2 fugitive. Please understand. It should be known that the background of this youth is quite impressive, and he has quite a number of treasures on him. We cannot take the chance of allowing him to escape and wreak more havoc in the future. DiVincenzo waved a hand, and a ripple spread across the 6 warships. Boom. Violent beams of lights connected the warships one after another, and under the astonished gazes of the spectators, the entire Void Palace was suddenly locked down in space, disallowing any covert methods of escape. Cornelius was very close to losing control of his temper entirely. Do you think that you can just take a disciple of the Void Palace because you say so? Where is your proof? Where is your evidence? Is this how Shield Cross Stars works? DiVincenzo shook his head. I'm afraid you are mistaken, esteemed sir. Lionel Morales is no longer a member of Void Palace. He did not use the God Path to enter the 6th dimension. Chapter 1707. Published at 16th of March, 2023. 6:06 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1707. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1707. Did I do good? Cornelius froze. His head almost subtly turned in one direction, but he caught himself before he did so. He knew exactly where Lionel was because he had been following him, but that didn't mean that Shield Cross Stars did. As shocking as their strength was, no one beneath the 8th dimension could just casually cover several planetary widths of space to find a single person. If they could, they wouldn't have to lock down the space. He wanted to refute what DiVincenzo said, but the latter seemed so certain, and he had no idea. When Lionel fought, whether it was against Conan or the Sword faction, he hadn't released his god runes even once. Unless Cornelius personally scanned Lionel with his internal sight, something he wouldn't do for the latter's privacy, it was impossible to tell. Plus, what he didn't know was that even if he was willing to do such a thing, whether or not he could actually get past Lionel's mental defenses was a different matter entirely. He had originally thought that Lionel was just so powerful that he didn't need to use his god runes, but then he suddenly remembered that in his battle up the Void Tower, Lionel hadn't used his god runes either, even up until the point of his death. A part of Cornelius wanted to believe that this was because Lionel expected something like this to happen, and as such held back a good portion of his strength. But was that possible? Even though he was completely caught off guard by all of this, was Lionel's foresight really so much better than his own? According to the rules of the Void Palace, anyone who failed to enter the sixth dimension with the God Path would be expelled, effective immediately. If what this Tier 2 officer was saying was true, then Lionel truly didn't have the protective badge of the Void Palace any longer. There's no need to doubt this matter, esteemed sir. The timeline is clear for you to check yourself. According to our information, Lionel Morales suffered the descent of the Cataclysm at Tier 9 of the 5th dimension. When he returned, he was in Tier 1, but he had never checked the technique stores of the Void Palace, so it's clear he took the easiest method. That proves nothing. You know his background as well as I do. True enough, he could have gained a method from the Morales family. Unfortunately, this isn't the case. The Void Tower formed a perfect replica of him when he entered, and it didn't sense the aura of the God Path. Shield Cross stars wouldn't act without proper assurances. Cornelius stopped talking, his expression turning placid. It was clear and obvious what this person was doing. He could have stated this as his first reason and left the matter at that, but he didn't, instead allowing Cornelius to speak more before shutting him down. Not only was this a humiliation, but it seemed to speak on the incompetence of the Void Palace. Lionel had entered the Void Tower days ago, and yet they were still unaware until now. Regardless, hopefully by now Lionel had used this opportunity to make some headway in running. This matter was still fishy to him, and he simply didn't believe that that man's son would do such a thing. Before that happened, Velasco himself would probably kill Lionel first. However, what happened next left Cornelius not knowing how to react at all. "Hello, I'm the fugitive you're looking for." Lionel's voice didn't seem to have much effort behind it either, and yet his projection didn't lose out to the two seventh-dimensional monsters in the skies at all. And how could it? With his current comprehension of resonance, this was all too easy for him. He sat on a building's roof, his feet dangling, a smile hanging from his lips. DiVincenzo's gaze sharpened as he looked toward Lionel, but despite the gaze of a seventh-dimensional expert being capable of shooting across such a large distance, Lionel didn't feel much pressure at all. This Tier 2 officer would have to be hundreds of times closer before Lionel would feel anything. In fact, considering how far apart they were, unless this person had the Bao domain lineage factor, in his eyes, Lionel was probably as small as a speck of dust right now if he could see Lionel clearly at all. That said, Lionel could see his face almost too clearly, and it was likely that DiVincenzo was well aware of this feeling, or else his face wouldn't have been so stiff for a moment. "Since you are willing to hand yourself in, then this matter will be easily resolved." "Hand myself in? Why would I do something like that?" Lionel chuckled. DiVincenzo's gaze narrowed. For some reason, he felt more pressure talking to this boy than he did Cornelius, but this wasn't because their strengths were equal, far from it. It was because EOF something more ethereal, potential. "This isn't a matter you can decide," Cornelius replied calmly. "Oh, is that so?" Lionel blinked innocently. With a flip of his palm, a familiar silver disc dictionary appeared. "Old man, your son's being bullied. Don't you think that you should do something about this?" DiVincenzo suddenly froze, his body subconsciously trembling as he moved, prepared to retreat. Lionel, who had on a very wronged expression just a moment ago, suddenly burst into a fit of laughter. Seeing DiVincenzo react as though he had just eaten a pile of shit had him rolling. Sorry. I'm just messing around. My old man has better things to do than be here. But it's funny, you're so scared yet you still dare to do this." DiVincenzo's expression darkened for the first time, the hints of red being overwhelmed by a malevolent blackness. Ooh. Just when DiVincenzo was about to attack in a state of half-fury, he froze again. This time, it was Lionel's turn to be stunned. At that moment, a hologram of his father appeared. Clearly, he hadn't expected this to actually happen. "Ah, you actually remembered I exist?" Lionel asked speechlessly. Velasco cleaned out his ear with a pinky. "Be more respectful, brat. Your mom is on my ass. If not for this, do you think I'd bother with yo? Excuse me? Do I have to tell you how to take care of your own son? At that moment, a familiar voice called out from a seemingly nearby distance, at least relative to wherever his father was. Lionel smiled beside himself, but then he froze. Wait, so this thing really can connect a call? Those weren't prank voicemails at all, were they? Velasco, who had just been caught, had nowhere to vent his hatred but toward an easy target. All those above the sixth dimension, scram. If you can still take the losses of losing at the hands of my seed, then you can continue to attack once that's fulfilled. After saying these words, Velasco seemed to ignore everything else as his hologram turned toward a certain direction. Wife, I did good, right? His voice cut out before the rest was said, which was probably good for the sake of Lionel's mental health. In the skies, though, the calm DiVincenzo seemed to have crimson serpents crawling beneath the skin of his forehead. Chapter 1708. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:06 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1708. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1708. Boulder. Lionel chuckled. But just when he was about to put the dictionary array, it flashed again and a familiar woman appeared. She had a warm smile on her face, and her eyes lit up as though Lionel was her whole world. Velasco might shrug it off, but she had been worried about Lionel's life and death for over a decade already. It was only now that she knew that he was safe and sound that she could finally exhale a breath. She reached out a hand but could only sigh when she remembered that the face before her was just a projection. Life was truly unfair. She never got the chance to watch her son grow. Although not a day passed where she didn't check in on him. Doing so from so many galaxies away was simply not the same. Mom will come see you when she gets a chance, okay, little lion? Lionel smiled lightly and nodded. Eleanor wiped away tears that threatened to form and nodded herself. Then, she looked toward the battleships in the distance, her beautiful gaze flickering with fury. From now on, Shield Cross stars will not be allowed to step a single foot into Earth's territory. You have one day to scram. If I see even a single branch remaining, I will kill without mercy. The words were like a boulder falling into a calm lake. The fury behind them was one thing, but the implications behind the words themselves were completely different. DiVincenzo's expression couldn't help but change wildly for the second time that day. He was truly speechless, not knowing what to say. By the time he gathered himself, his expression could only be described as ugly. He had already known that this mission would be difficult, which was why he was so forceful to begin with. He had no choice but to use such a stance, hoping to force what was brittle to break. But he hadn't expected things to turn out this way. What right do you have to say such a thing? Is the Morales family truly trying to monopolize Earth? This was the only thing that DiVincenzo could say and the only rebuttal he had. But what he heard next left him truly without words. What right? Eleanor sneered. There's no one in existence with more rights than I have. And if there was, it would only be because I handed the decision down to my little lion. I am Eleanor Morales, and the world spirit of Earth has chosen me. I won't repeat myself again. The time is already ticking. You have 23 hours and 58 minutes left. DiVincenzo froze. Let alone him, several others did as well. Very simply put, this was not widely known information. In fact, let alone not widely known. Even those who should have been in the know were completely ignorant of the fact. To the people of the Void Palace and even the Void Elders, Eleanor was the offspring of the Luxnix family. But this made sense. How could anyone expect for Earth to have already produced a seventh-dimensional expert? According to the time, Earth had undergone its metamorphosis just barely 30 or so years ago. But Eleanor had been in the dimensional verse for far longer than that. And for her to be so, that meant that her father or her mother, one of which was definitely from Earth, had to have entered the dimensional verse long before even that. But how was that possible? How could a third-dimensional world possibly enter the dimensional verse under their own prowess? No, worse yet, how could they do so under the constant monitoring of the powers of the human domain? Eleanor turned away from the fleet and smiled toward Lionel again. In an instant, She had gone from an enraged lioness to a doting mother. Mother will see you soon, be safe. Eleanor waved maybe a bit too hard before the image flickered and vanished, leaving the disc resting in silence on Lionel's palm. Lionel remained silent for a moment before shaking his head. This matter seemed to be becoming more and more complicated. He didn't know that this was a secret, honestly. He had always acted under the assumption that it wasn't. But the implication that it was a secret was quite heavy, and this felt like a gloves-off sort of moment that he happened to be in the center of. The silence of the atmosphere seemed to realize this as well. And clearly even Shield Cross stars, with their wealth of information networks, was completely ignorant to this matter until Eleanor laid it all out on the table so clearly. Lionel stood up, stretching his back out and yawning. He looked to his side, finding that Aina was still there, but he wasn't very surprised by this. Of course she was. If he tried to send her away, she might send him away with a kick first. Craning his neck a bit, he saw his aunt. She seemed to want to fight too, but he shook his head. If she fought, wouldn't those seventh-dimensional existences have an excuse to attack? Well, it wasn't that Lionel trusted them not to attack anyway. His old man was way too casual about all of this. But if they did, he would probably just have to find a method of dealing with it. Right then, an inconspicuous member of the crowd caught Lionel's. He could be described as the stereotypical tall, dark and handsome archetype that females swooned for. He had high cheekbones, a chiseled jaw, and eyes and hair as black as night. Lionel had never personally seen this man before, but he could recognize the emblem on the latter's chest. That was the same emblem of the Winding Shadow Legacy faction, run by none other than Ronan Sith, and the very same faction that Lionel had gotten information about Triana from. Meeting this man's gaze, Lionel's own narrowed. Everyone else just seemed here ready to spectate, but why did it seem like this young man in particular came ready for battle? Chapter 1709. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:06 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1709. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1709. Alright, oh. Lionel's expression went from serious to a light smile. Not only was this Ronin character prepared, he was also very close to Lionel's real location. He was barely half a kilometer away. At that distance, even if he didn't have the Bao domain lineage factor, it would have been too easy to spot him. Even if he was beaten to death, Lionel wouldn't believe that this was a coincidence. There were only two possibilities, and only one of them truly made sense considering this man's last name was Sith. The current Lionel was well aware that the Sith represented the assassination units of Shield Cross stars. This was no coincidence. Even if Lionel hadn't exposed his location, it was likely that Ronan had been monitoring him all the while. The moment he tried to hide, the latter would have taken action. Ronan was already in the 7th dimension, a worthy power level for a man who ruled over one of the most important factions of the Void Palace. However, Lionel still looked at him as though he was staring at prey. In the skies above, DiVincenzo slowly regained his composure. Although things had already gotten out of hand, there was already no turning back. They had come here with the intent to sacrifice for the sake of maintaining order. Shield Cross stars wouldn't bow in the face of power and prestige, or else how would they continue to be the protectors of the human domain? I will give you one more chance to hand yourself in. If you do not comply, not only will you become a Tier 1 fugitive, but your sentencing will be far harsher. Lionel suddenly yawned beside himself. He was truly a bit tired. It took quite a lot out of him to fully assimilate the Void Tower, and he hadn't had time to rest then. However, it could be said that his timing was quite horrible. He was maybe one of the only few men in existence who still had time to be tired in the face of such a fleet of planetary warships. After a moment, Lionel looked away from Ronan, and his gaze pierced the veil and landed on Cornelius. Hey old man, there's still a chance here. If the Void Palace does what it's supposed to do and protects its disciples from nonsense, I won't mind being a bit more obedient. But if you don't, well, beneath the 7th dimension, I doubt there's anyone here who can survive my blade, and I most certainly won't be showing any mercy. So what will it be? Cornelius' expression twitched. This brat, couldn't he lay down his pride for a second and say it nicely? Does he know that these old fogies care about their faces the most? Almost as soon as he finished this thought, Cornelius felt 3 auras appear in the skies. Had Lionel been there when Rosen reported his matters to the Void Elders, he would have recognized them as Void Elder Vimark, Void Elder Galien, and Void Elder Lisbeth. Galien, the female drill sergeant lookalike among them, peered down from the skies with hints of fury in her gaze. However, when Lionel's eyes panned over, he didn't seem to notice her anger at all, as though he was still waiting for an answer, and expected it out of one of these 3 since Cornelius couldn't speak. This was truly the last chance that Lionel was giving. No matter how powerful Shield Cross Stars was, could they compare to the geniuses of the Void Palace? Only their star-rank path officers would. But even if there were others in hiding while only DiVincenzo stepped out, they would be in the 6th dimension and only equivalent to Void Palace geniuses. If that was the case, what did Lionel have to fear from them, exactly? They'd have to bring out the heavy machinery to deal with them, but by that point, they would also risk killing the disciple of the Void Palace. This was all to say that if there was anyone with a chance of threatening him, it would come from the disciples of the Void Palace themselves. And if they came for him in an attempt to help Shield Cross Stars bring him in, well, like he had said, his blade wouldn't show mercy. This could be considered the only chance at mercy he would give. Void Elder Lisbeth wanted to speak, but before she could only smile bitterly as Galien finally snapped. The latter had been waiting for Lionel to speak first, but who would have thought that Lionel wouldn't be in a hurry at all? You are just like your father. Unruly, completely ignorant of propriety and the greater good. Why should the Void Palace protect a disciple like you? One that is so selfish and conceited. I do not know whether Shield Cross Stars speaks the truth or not, but what I do know is that an organization that has given their all to protecting the peace of the human domain would not speak without reason. And I have also seen your character firsthand. What about you deserves the benefit of my doubt? Lionel suddenly yawned again, this one lasting so long that his eyes watered. Reaching a hand upward, he wiped his eyes and blinked, trying to stave off his fatigue. As real and unabashed as his actions were, they only made Galien more infuriated. Each maybe of this family was worse than the last. The father had been unruly and even attacked and killed. The uncle entered and exited as he pleased, although he had long since been expelled and banished. And now the son and nephew was doing as he pleased as well. But the difference between them was that the father and uncle had the capital to be so arrogant. What did this pup have exactly? All right, Lionel said, lightly stretching. At that moment, his body began to slowly emit a white gold light that only became more blinding with every passing second. I hope you don't regret it. Instant recovery. Chapter 1710. Published at 16th of March, 2023, 6:06 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1710. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1710. No explanation. Galien was so infuriated by Lionel's words that she laughed. To everyone else, the Void Elders were a mighty and worshipped existence. They had never seen one disrespected, or seen anyone dare to disrespect them. It left them in a silence. But even as Galien's laughter echoed, Lionel and Aina suddenly moved at once, crossing a 500-meter distance in just a few breaths and appearing before the Winding Shadow Legacy faction. Ronan's gaze flickered, clearly not having expected this. It wasn't like Lionel and Aina were moving faster than he could react to. After all, he was in the 7th dimension. He felt like it would only take the matter of a wave of the hand to deal with this, but just when he wanted to, he hesitated. The legend of Velasco was deeply ingrained, and he knew if that man was truly infuriated, his Sith family wouldn't be able to protect him at all. But what was this Lionel doing coming toward him like this? Suddenly, both Lionel and Aina gripped at the air, manifesting their weapons from their own respective spatial devices. In that instant, a bloodthirsty aura descended from the skies, murderous intentions lighting their eyes. Ronan froze. He was, indeed, the reason much of this had happened. He had been paying keen attention to Lionel for a long time, ever since he had come to his faction. In doing so, he found out that Lionel actually had a charge that had never been followed through on. The details of that case were vague and odd, nothing about it seemed to add up. It only said that Lionel was in cahoots with a variant invalid who had set its roots on a weak fourth-dimensional world called Terrain. There wasn't much information about this, but what was interesting was that it was said that this so-called puppet master had led an attack on Earth more than 25 years ago. This was especially interesting to Shield Cross stars because they had a vested interest in keeping Earth safe and free of outside influences for as long as possible. So, the idea that Lionel was connected to a variant invalid who seemed to have tried to carve out a piece of Earth was especially important. It was enough to feel like a smoking gun. Shield Cross stars had been very strict with protecting the rise of Earth, because of its importance to the human domain. Since the Void Palace's blades were pointed outward and their shields pointed inward, it was their duty. So when evidence that an heir of the Morales family had potentially tried to step over this taboo, it was a huge deal, and Ronan immediately brought this matter to his Sith family, which then pushed it on upward to the wider big brass of Shield Cross stars. This was all to say that from the perspective of Shield Cross stars, this wasn't just about Lionel. It was also about the Morales stepping over a line that they shouldn't have. As such, just to ensure that they had jurisdiction to act, they raised his fugitive tier to 2. But now that it was exposed that Lionel's mother was actually the world spirit holder of Earth, this conspiracy seemed to have gained several layers. Although this put into question Lionel's guilt, what it essentially confirmed was that the Morales really had ignored this taboo and done as they pleased. It could be said from a certain perspective that under everyone's noses, Earth had become the territory of the Morales. And this was a huge deal. Enormous. It essentially spit in the face of Shield Cross stars, and then grinded it in with the sole of a shoe. Now, even though Lionel was likely to be innocent, and there was a deeper matter to this story, they still had to capture him for the sake of demanding an answer from the Morales. While there were other Morales members here, Shield Cross stars was weighed down by bureaucracy. Since they only had a case against Lionel, only he could be used. As such, they were riding a tiger they simply couldn't step down from. Ronan's body shuddered. He realized that Lionel and Aina's targets wasn't even himself, but rather his fellow Sith family members behind him. Stop. Just as Ronan was about to act, a suffocating aura descended upon him. In the distance, a beauty who looked as though her body was covered from head to toe in oil stood on a building. But just her gaze alone was enough to make Ronan feel as though his body had been plunged into a vat of ice. Ronan's eyes turned red, but he couldn't do anything. That moment seemed to slow toward infinity. Lionel met his gaze, the cold indifference within them causing Ronan to shudder for a completely different reason. For a second he truly regretted making an enemy out of this boy. Lionel didn't call him out. He didn't speak words of rage or demand an explanation. The moment he deduced the impetus of everything happening here, he attacked without mercy. He was the same caliber of madman as his father. He didn't care to explain himself. He didn't care to listen to an explanation. He had been crossed, and that was all he needed to know. Lionel's spear and Aina's axe swung out together, the momentum of their strikes causing the eyes of the Winding Shadow faction members to widen. They hurried to defend themselves, but many were caught off guard, believing that their leader would have easily been able to stop these two. By the time they realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Blood sprayed beneath the shocked gaze of the spectators. It had only been 2 seconds since Lionel told the Void Elder that he hoped she didn't regret it. To many in the distance, his words hadn't even fully sunk in yet, but blood had already been shed. Gallienne's eyes widened. Boy. The fury behind her booming voice caused the Void Palace to quake. Chapter 1711. Published at 18th of March, 2023, 7:10 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1711. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1711. Decision. Lionel slammed the butt of his spear in the ground, causing the earth to crack splinter as wild waves of earth force spread out in all directions. After slaughtering dozens with just a single swing of his blade, he didn't seem to be in a rush to run. In fact, he stood calmly, just a few meters away from Ronan, as though he had just killed over 50% of his faction in just a single movement. Aina came to a stop by his side, and it was only now that others seemed to realize that without having even been implicated in this matter herself, She had ensured that she would be with a single action. It was clear that between the Void Palace and Lionel, she had chosen the latter without a second thought. The elders in the sky were absolutely furious, but Lionel only raised his head into the skies, a familiar light smile on his face. He looked unbothered and unhurried. There was only one way out of this place, and that was to cross outside the boundaries of space the 6 planetary warships had put up. Lionel had several ideas on how he might do this, but none of them could be implemented casually, and they most definitely couldn't be rushed. In such a situation, Lionel didn't need to be in a hurry to do anything immediately, so his first thought was to establish dominance. No matter how strong he was, he didn't feel like dealing with an avalanche of disciples coming at him from all directions, so he wanted to prove a few things, firstly that he had the balls to kill, and secondly that he had the power to do so. Too few knew the name Lionel Morales, so they would just have to find out today. In the skies, Cornelius closed his eyes and sighed. The moment Lionel took action, there was truly no taking a step back. Unfortunately for him, as far as Lionel was concerned, the moment Void Elder Gallienne had spoken those words, putting her own pride at the forefront instead of the greater good, it was already too late to take a step back. Gallienne's roar of fury still echoed overhead as Lionel met her gaze. He seemed to be goading her to attack. He wanted to see exactly what the weight of his father's words were. He wasn't exactly being careless with his life. With how things were now, Gallienne and the others were much too far away to attack him. Lionel could see them as though they were right before his face, but even 7th-dimensional experts couldn't attack across thousands of kilometers in an environment that was completely free of anarchic force, let alone here where the densest concentration of it existed. By Lionel's calculations, it would take several minutes before Gallienne could close the distance and enter range to attack him. While others thought that Lionel was in mortal danger already, in truth, the greatest danger to him now was Ronan, who was already being bound by his aunt. As such, in a situation like this one, poking and testing the limits of the Void Elders and the other 7th-dimensional experts was exactly what he needed. Whether they dared to attack or not would decide how he moved forward. In her rage, Gallienne took a step forward, already prepared to blaze a trail toward Lionel and teach this bow a lesson. But at that moment, the old man beside her grabbed her shoulder. Gallienne's head snapped toward Vimark in a rage, but the latter still just shook his head. "There are only 2 choices," he said in a voice that could only be heard by them. "It's either you forget this matter and let it go, leaving it to Shield Cross Stars to handle, or you have the disciples attack. There is no in between. We cannot afford to give that madman a reason to rampage again." "You." Gallienne was so infuriated that her face turned into a ripe tomato. Her wrinkles shook as though suffering the effects of an earthquake, and her seemingly frail limbs caused space itself to tremble. There are other ways to deal with him. No matter how talented he is still just in Tier 1. If you really cannot handle it, just set it as a goal for the factions and reward them. They've been fighting wars longer than he's even been alive. Of course, do make sure that the other Morales heirs know that if they interfere, they too will be kicked out of the Void Palace. Or we can simply allow Shield Cross Stars to act as they please. Vimark was well aware of Gallienne's fiery personality. If he simply told her what to do, it would never work. She was fiercely loyal to the Void Palace and had no patience for those who shirked responsibility, especially after she had already sacrificed the whole of her life to this cause. But if he gave her a choice like this, then things would work out much better. Gallienne seemed to struggle for a moment before she took a breath and released it. When Vimark saw this, he already knew what the decision would be. If it was anything else, then Gallienne wouldn't be Gallienne. "Disciples of Void Palace." Her voice boomed. The words echoed and many clenched their fists. No one spoke, from the lowest nominal disciple to the highest domain disciple. This was the respect that Void Elders were afforded. The respect earned through a lifetime of sacrifice. The respect given for a group of individuals who lived for the greater good first, and their own desires second. Lionel's eyes narrowed. He could feel the prestige bearing down on him, weighing upon his shoulders and seemingly wanting to press him into the ground. Despite the distance between them, it was almost suffocating, more oppressive than any aura he had ever felt before. "Hear me well. None of you are to interfere. The Void Palace no longer has two such disciples, and this matter will be handled by Shield Cross Stars. Those who disobey will likewise be expelled. Chapter 1712. Published at 18th of March, 2023, 7:10 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1712. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1712. When Lionel's gaze flickered with surprise before he actually smiled and chuckled. Without much fanfare, he looked toward Aina. Let's go. Lionel tapped a foot and he and Aina shot forward, their speed blazing a trail through Void Palace. In the skies, a far distance away, DiVincenzo's expression warped. He too hadn't expected the Void Palace to choose to take such a stance. Initially, he had been planning on forcing their hand, but his gaze flickered, landing on the running Lionel. It's him. He did it on purpose. Lionel seemed to have been playing the role of wastrel from the very beginning, and he had subtly pushed the Void Elders of the Void Palace into a corner, where there was only so much that they could do. The moment he chose to slaughter those disciples without mercy, everything had already been set in stone. It was either they attack all out or retreat, there was no in between. However, should they choose to attack, the consequences would be unimaginable. By making his stance so clear and showing his lack of hesitation, not to mention his personal strength, Lionel had forced Galien to have no choice but to make this decision. At that moment, DiVincenzo's jaw steeled, suddenly feeling that he wasn't facing a child at all. But before he could even decide how to handle this situation, he sensed several gazes land on him, making him feel as though his heart would stop beating any moment now. You may not attack freely. Do not put our disciples in danger, or you'll have to deal with me first. Cornelius spoke calmly and evenly, his words clearly speaking for the elders as well. Since they had made such a decision, they wouldn't allow outside influences to harm the children. If they wanted to deal with Lionel, they would have to wait until he was out of range of the possibility of harming any other disciple. DiVincenzo's gaze slowly moved from Cornelius to the others before he realized that there was truly no changing their minds. When he looked back down to meet Lionel's gaze again, he saw that very same slick smile that caused an eruption of fury to dance within his veins, but there was already nothing more that he could do. Squadrons deploy. DiVincenzo's voice moved. Target is moving toward the northern gate of the Void Palace. Cut off all paths of retreat. At that moment, the silent planetary vessels finally showed some signs of life, numerous hatchets and lights opening as a flood of powerful individuals surged out. Despite the fact they looked like a swarm of locusts, they moved seamlessly, not a single person getting in the way of another. Lionel's pupils constricted as he calmly observed this matter. If there was anything that would endanger him at this point, it would be if the Shield Cross Stars had similar methods of borrowing power from one another, methods that he had personally seen in the zone previously. Judging by how these groups were moving in trios, and trios were moving in larger sets of 30, Lionel could see through this in an instant. While others saw a swarm, he saw the inner workings of a force art. Aina. Faster. Lionel was enveloped by a blinding sheen of white gold, 3 tails appearing to his back. At the same time, an equally blinding crimson light erupted from Aina, filling the air with the smell of bloody roses. The two shot into the forest, their speed putting even some 7th-dimensional experts to shame. The moment they hit this gear, DiVincenzo, who was monitoring their position from the skies all this time, felt his heart lurch into his throat. In what felt like the blink of an eye, they covered hundreds of kilometers, leaving the sights of the disciples and entering the dense forest of the Void Palace. Aina smiled. I bet I can kill more than you. Lionel started and nearly lost his footing on a branch he leapt off from. He was still focusing on his strategy and didn't expect to suddenly hear this. He turned toward her after a moment and grinned. As if. Instead of replying directly, Aina smiled sweetly. Try to keep up. At that moment, Aina became a blur. In just that split second, even Lionel's eyes couldn't keep up, fragment of Bao domain lineage factor or not. She became like a wisp of blood, her body moving so fast that it tore through the veil of space, and appeared over 100 kilometers ahead of Lionel in an instant. Lionel was rendered speechless again. Was that the Blood Sovereign tablet at work? What the hell did that kind of speed have to do with blood force? Lionel shook his head and recovered. Clearly, he couldn't let this little vixen have her way. His starry light domain bloomed, rising up and shooting past 10 kilometers. In an instant, he blinked forward over 10 times, covering the same distance Aina had. At that point, let alone putting some 7th-dimensional experts to shame, there were probably very few Tier 1 7th-dimensional experts that could match them in this regard. Lionel's body flickered in a streak of light, appearing 10 kilometers in the sky. He felt his wind rushing across his skin, his hair dancing like a river of white to his back as a distinctly bestial grin spread across his face. He raised his spear, but it suddenly vanished into the form of a bow. The white lion bow seemed to unleash a roar as Lionel knocked an arrow. Just as he was about to release, a scythe of bloody red tore through the air, tearing through the front line of descending warriors. Lionel's grin turned into a lip twitch as he watched his original target be severed into two. Before anyone could react, a tide of blood rose into the air, the corpses of several valiant warriors turning into rotating lotuses that shredded trees, stone and flesh apart alike. Shit. Lionel put his bow away, flashing forward and appearing on the ground before flashing forward again. He had to hurry up or she really would win. Chapter 1713. Published at 18th of March, 2023, 7:10 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1713. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1713. Full deployment. DiVincenzo's eyes widened. He had been so focused on Lionel and his danger that he hadn't paid much attention to this girl. Quite frankly, he wasn't even entirely sure of who she was. But the instant she burst forward with that speed, he was forced to pay attention even if he didn't want to. And the moment she started killing, let alone him, everyone's eyes were on her. Aina walked through the forest, her axe swinging in wide arcs from side to side. But the most shocking part was that he was easily dozens of kilometers from her nearest target. Somehow, she had some sort of symbiotic, quantum relationship with the blood force in the distance. The instant she swung, axe force that should have been on her blade appeared kilometers ahead, fusing with the blood force and shredding everything in its path to pieces. At the same time, blood roses formed in the air one after another, growing larger and larger with every dead target it assimilated. Let alone DiVincenzo, even Lionel was shocked. Even he couldn't attack across such a long distance. Despite the fact he was well ahead of Aina now, he had still been forward to bring out his bow, only to realize that she still managed to somehow attack first. Obviously, the warriors of Shield Cross Stars were taken aback as well. They had been bracing themselves, prepared to deploy their battle tactics, only to realize that the threat they thought was still making their way over here was actually already here. A coercive pressure weighed down on the surroundings, the extremely heavy weight of a powerful might spreading out in all directions. Lionel recognized almost instantly that this mind was Aina's. Her coercive pressure had actually progressed to this point. So that's how. She must have her own version of a dream world or starry spirit domain, but instead this one controls blood force. Lionel's foot pressed into the ground hard, causing cracks to spread out in all directions as he shot forward like a cannon. This was excellent. He thought he would have to worry about Aina being on the front lines, which was also why he planned to use his bow to support her. But if things were like this, then he could truly go all out. As he blazed a trail forward, he could feel the heaviness of space around him. Using his emulation spatial force had become easily 3 to 5 times more difficult, and teleporting was an impossibility with the lock in space. But none of that would matter once they left this encirclement. Activate. Activate it now. There's no time. Pairs of threes. The words were incoherent, not making much sense to those not of Shield Cross Stars. But it was still enough for Lionel's eyes to narrow. Now huh? Lionel burst out of a clearing, finding the surroundings to be quite familiar. This could be one of the villages, Village 0218 to be exact. However, these villages were only used during disciple recruitment, so they were completely empty now, and provided quite a large bit of flat land for battle. Lionel leapt up, clearing the 10-meter wall that had taken him some effort a year ago in a single bound. When he stepped over the other side, he found blood and carnage, a large number of bloody roses hanging in the skies. Behind these roses, the warriors of Shield Cross stars took up their formations, radiant lights forming around them. For each pair of three, a shield that seemed formed of starlight took shape. They emitted glittering silvers and radiant translucent blues. If it wasn't for the situation, Lionel might feel that they were quite beautiful. This time, when Aina's blood roses rotated forward, they bent and shattered against the shields, breaking into sprinkling petals of crimson that splashed onto the ground like a puddle of red rain. Lionel's spear appeared in his palm, his gaze turning sharp. He pierced forward, his spear streaking through the distance between himself and them in the blink of an eye. Clang! The trio Lionel targeted was sent stumbling back, but their shield didn't have the slightest crack on it. Lionel's eyes narrowed. The technique was stronger than he thought, and if he let them gather any more together, it would be even more troublesome. If Lionel was correct, these trios could be fused in groups of 10 to create an even stronger shield. Compared to the techniques he had seen in the zone, this was actually much simpler. Because it focused entirely on defense, it could be used with less people and still have powerful outputs. When it was powered by 3 Tier 9 6-dimensional existences like this, the defensive power wasn't small in the slightest. The tip of Lionel's spear trembled, a delicate golden light forming around it as the world went silent. Absolute spear domain. Lionel's spear pierced forward once more like a streak of light across the skies. Before the stumbling trio could react, their shield shattered into motes of light, the head of their captain bursting like a watermelon. Lionel appeared in their midst, his spear becoming like the scythe of a reaper. Everywhere he passed, another head would fall. His blade was relentless, and the rotating tornado of his absolute spear domain was even more unforgiving. Over the horizon, Aina caught up, realizing that her long-distance attacks weren't working anymore. Reaching out a delicate hand, she clutched it. The blood roses fused into one, forming a thorny pasture that surged forward. The two cut through the protectors of humanity's peace, as though they were nothing more than barbarians. This was the kind of scene that would be imprinted into the minds of all those that saw it. In the skies, DiVincenzo realized the mistake he had made. Sending in squadrons to deal with these duo was simply sending them to their deaths, but having already made such a mistake, it was already impossible to reverse. He grit his teeth hard, his gaze flickering with ill intent. Full deployment. War sequence Tier 1. The 6 planetary warships quaked. Many of the warriors were surprised, but that didn't stop them from reacting. Full deployment? That meant that even the ship's engineers and drivers were to enter the charge. However, that was less important than the fact it demanded the elite troops make their appearance. In comparison to this, though, War Sequence Tier 1 was a far bigger deal. It meant that they were meant to treat this assault as though they were reinforcing a Tier 1 fleet. In simple terms, it meant that they were meant to go all out as though facing an enemy far above their pay grade. Chapter 1714. Published at 18th of March, 2023, 7:10 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1714. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1714. One sentence. Within the planetary warships, the warriors of Shield Cross stars moved about like the ants of a colony, the speed and organization reaching an immaculate realm. At that moment, within the personal cabins of some of the most elite troops there were, several meditating powerhouses slowly opened their eyes, their auras flashing with a robust heaviness before retracting into gentle streams of cool wind. One after another, they stood. Each one of these individuals was completely in the nude, soaking in a dense jelly-like substance. They stepped out with a movement and immediately became dry beneath an odd, inexplicable process. They dressed themselves systematically. The rhythm was so smooth and without hitches that it would be clear to anyone watching that they had done this thousands of times. Although their rituals were all different, each one had one that they had drilled into their minds over decades. However, no matter how different their processes were, in exactly 3 seconds, they all had finished dressing themselves and stepped out. The moment they did, the hustle and bustle of the planetary warships seemed to slow and quiet, the echoes of their footsteps setting a new rhythm that they all fell into. They stretched out their hands. As obedient as servants, several groups rushed forward and handed them halberds twice the height of their bodies. They stretched out their forearms. In just as quick movements, several more groups rushed forward and handed them shields that weighed as heavy as mountains. The moment they were equipped with weapons and shields, their steps only became heavier, the rumbling momentum causing even the warship itself to quake and shake. The more these echoes resonated, the more controlled the others seemed to become. With every passing second, the cohesion of the group grew further. Even as they increased their pace of movement, the smoothness remained the same and, in fact, greatened. As though they were perfectly choreographed traffic, no one interrupted the path of another person, even to the point their shoulders didn't brush. These entities stepped out, reaching the bow of their ships as crowds of warriors, previously seemingly moving in an unorganized swarm, formed neat and even lines to their back. For each one of these 6 planetary warships, there were 12 such existences, each one wielding the very same halberd and shield. The uniformity was immaculate. Their faces seemed hardly recognizable to the public, but to the terrorist organizations of the dimensional verse, they were all too well known. Captain Zildjian. This name meant nothing to the vast majority. However, to the people of the colloquially known Zealot sector, his name rang fear in all of their hearts. The so-called Zealot sector was a region of the human domain where there was an increased activity in gods and faiths due to certain unique opportunities presented. Unfortunately, that also made it a hotbed of religious extremists and cults which took advantage of the poor and needy, feeding them into systems that created sex trafficking rings and began cycles of hatred. This region was Captain Zildjian's stomping ground. Over the years of his dominance, he came to be known as the Guillotine Apostate. The number of shrines and places of worship he had felled beneath his blade, and soaked beneath rivers of blood were too numerous to count. Captain Earth. This name meant nothing to the vast majority. However, to the people of the Skyward sector, her name shook their souls and sunk claws into their hearts. The Skyward sector was one of the few barbarian sectors of the human domain. There were only 2 methods of gaining such a title, both of which usually came hand in hand. The first was that there was not a prominent human family or organization in majority control of the land, and the second was that it had a population of non-human exceeding 20%. The Oryx were not the only non-human race in the human domain. There were batches of others in minority positions that had learned to coexist with humans, one of which being the Skyward race. Still, in such regions, the locations tended to be particularly lawless. Since these regions could not be controlled by humans, it was obvious that the humans there tended to be quite weak, and the other races there tended to be quite strong. Due to other powers being more focused on their own regions and maintaining control, Shield Cross Stars could only do its best to maintain order. When Captain Earth gained jurisdiction over the Skyward sector, though, what once was a lawless region quickly became great obedient. Even now, the odd winged race followed to her back, having wings that alternated in leather skin and feathers, while having faces with prominent noses seemingly built with aerodynamics in mind. Alone she had subdued an entire sector. Captain Vimward. This name meant nothing to the vast majority. Even to the people of the Necro sector he oversaw, this name was completely unknown to them. However, the name that they did know was that of the Shield Reaper. The Necro sector was the deadest sector in the human domain. It had an abnormally large concentration of dark and corrosion forces, making it impossible for most to live there normally. Those that did were often sickly, malnourished and frail of body. This made them easy for beasts to prey upon, and it was considered to be a region where beasts reigned supreme. That was, until Captain Vimward set his flag and marched. These were just three of the 72 that had appeared, each one with a more vicious title and history than the last, and each fully prepared to lay down their lives in the name of the human race. A silence fell over the battlefield as though all of the noise had been sucked out of the air. These 12 stood at the bows of their ships. Although less than a second had passed since they had appeared, somehow it felt like an eternity. And then they jumped. Lionel felt his spine tingle. He tapped his foot on the ground, retreating slightly and retracting his spear. Aina seemed to notice his change immediately and reacted in kind. Her hair fluttered in the air as she stepped onto a rotating blood rose. With a raise of her hands, the others followed along with her. Bang! 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 The land trembled as a tsunami of earth rose into the air and spread out in all directions. Lionel's eyes narrowed as his head raised. Boom! 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 The earth collapsed, causing the ground to shake so fiercely that it almost threatened to throw him off balance. Dust was thrown into the, threatening to make visibility an impossibility. The Void Palace was already known for its dense fog, so this only made the situation several times more difficult to handle. However, before it could truly get out of hand, all of the dust was suddenly pressed into the ground as though a hand had descended from the skies above. When Lionel's vision finally cleared, he found that both he and Aina were surrounded by towering shields the size of buildings. There were exactly 72 of them, each of them shimmering with a resplendent starlight. They alternated between silver and royal blue depending on the angle, their translucent nature being just transparent enough to show the powerful armies that stood behind them. Then, the sound of footsteps began to resonate. Each and every one of them walked at the exact same pace, raising the exact same leg and walking forward in unison. The resonance made it sound as though a single giant was moving through forward, each one aimed right for Lionel's heart. Boom, boom, boom. As they moved, the encirclement closed in, closing all paths of retreat. Lionel slowly relaxed, exhaling a long breath. It seemed that he probably couldn't play around anymore. His head angled upward again, looking toward the 6 planetary warships with narrowed eyes. In the distance, DiVincenzo and the Void Elders stood high in the skies, watching this scene. None of them easily revealed their inner thoughts with their expressions. However, it was clear that they all felt that this matter was over, subconsciously relaxing. DiVincenzo didn't slowly increase the pressure. The moment he saw that things weren't going well, he dialed up the heat to the greatest output he had, unwilling to take any more chances. However, never in his wildest dreams did he think that things might very well come crumbling down with a single sentence from Lionel. Lionel, who was just about to get serious, paused for a moment, his brow raising. His gaze shifted and he slowly landed on 3 people. You, and you. With the training these warriors had, they simply continued to walk forward as though nothing at all had happened. However, Lionel didn't seem too shocked by this at all. The ones he had pointed to hard reacted at all, until, that is, he pointed to the last one. 1 wasn't an issue. 2 was a coincidence. But 3 was a pattern. A pattern that shattered the status quo with another few words. Neither of the 3 of you are human. Cloud race, I presume? Lionel clearly wasn't asking a question. In fact, he was making a very clear accusation. While he could break out of this encirclement using effort, it would take a lot out of him, and he would most definitely end up injured. Plus, outside of himself, Aina would likely suffer as well. If there was a chance to use his head and intelligence instead, why wouldn't he? As for the 3 he had pointed to, they were none other than Zildjian, Urith and Vimward. Important announcement below. Chapter 1715. Published at 22nd of March, 2023, 7:39 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1715. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1715. 1 for 1, let alone everyone else. Even Aina's expression flickered when Lionel said this. After a brief moment of surprise, DiVincenzo immediately believed that Lionel was speaking nonsense, and if he did so, there was even less to say about the marching warriors of Shield Cross Stars. With their training, it took more than just a few words for their focus to waver. But who was Lionel? Was he a fool who couldn't understand something so simple? The moment he finished speaking, his body flickered and vanished. When he appeared once again, not only was he right before Captain Vimward's troops, his body was enveloped by a radiant bronze aura that shone brighter than even gold. With the way his hair danced and his spear struck forward, he looked like the descendant of a Greek god. Everything from his demeanor to his aura releasing a stifling, undying pressure. The sound in the world vanished, and a vast painting seemed to unfurl to Lionel's back. Seas of blood, rains of bone, lands of flesh appeared. Anyone laying eyes on it felt their hearts tremble. In that moment, it felt as though the light smile that always hung from Lionel's lips was no more than a mask hiding behind it the black heart of a demon. Lionel's spear became like a river of blood, the mere tremble of its tip causing tsunami-like waves to spread out to the left and right. All the while, his gaze was locked onto Vimward's. There didn't seem to be any emotion behind it. There was no coldness, no happiness, no anger, no fury. There was nothing but a vast, unfathomable depth, one that seemed to peer even into the souls of those who looked into it. Vimward shuddered, his expressionless visage finally trembling somewhat. The cadence of the march shifted only the slightest bit, but that was enough for the radiant shield to dim just the slightest bit. Bang! Lionel's spear collided with the shield. He felt as though he had met a steel wall with the fist of a mortal. His forearms and wrists trembled, threatening to snap on impact. However, at that moment, the radiant bronze aura trembled, spreading out the reverberating impact toward the ground beneath his feet and the air around him. Small pockets of explosions surged in the surrounding area, a small measure of it re-upping and fusing with Lionel's strike, increasing his strike by small margins at a time. Crack! The eyes of DiVincenzo and the Shield Cross Stars warriors sharpened. A crack in their shield. That was impossible. Considering the standard of officers used to form it, this should have been an impossible task for anyone beneath the 7th dimension. How could a Tier 1 6th-dimensional brat possibly accomplish this? Captain Vimward's irises flickered with a malevolent light. He waved a hand, sending out several military-grade hand signs known by only the members of his troops. However, Lionel didn't need to understand to know that it must be an attack sequence. If all these people could do was defend, they would be too useless. The power of this formation was something Lionel had already seen through, and it was something he could have seen through even if he hadn't personally read some anecdotes about it in the Void Library. This defense was an exceptionally rare formation, allowing perfect defense from one side and perfect transparency from the other. This meant that while under the protection of this formation, the warriors of Shield Cross Stars could still attack freely so long as it was done in a coordinated fashion that didn't disrupt the cadence that allowed them to use this formation in the first place. Unfortunately, a blur of red appeared to Lionel's side. Even as she swung his axe, her beauty was truly unmatched. The powerful, streamlined outline of her body exploded forth with a hidden power that didn't seem possible. The wind stacked up on the edge of her blade, following up on Lionel's strike in one smooth motion. Lionel hadn't even fully retracted his spear when she acted. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Bang! Aina's Battle AXS blade landed right where Lionel's spear point had just retracted from. Like sparkling motes of light in the form of twinkling shards of glass, the radiant royal blue and silver illusory shield shattered. A long distance away, DiVincenzo froze, but it was already too late. Lionel only took a single step back to deal with the recoil before he shot through the opening the two had created as the officers of Vimward's troop coughed up blood beneath the backlash of their collapsed formation. Aina took a step back as well, just a measure after Lionel, before quickly following up. The two were like a pair tied together by a tight string, following one after another completely in sync. Lionel appeared before Vimward, who took up the vanguard of the formation, his face wearing a malevolent grin. His spear spun in his hands before it thrust forward, leaving several shadows in the air. Vimward's expression changed. He immediately changed his hand signals and retreated, two of his vice captains following him as they settled into a formation of 3 as their troops followed suit. Pockets of squads of 3 separated, but some were still too slow. They had just withstood the backlash of their formation collapsing, so how could they all reform another one so fast? While it looked like Lionel was aiming for Vimward, the tips of his spear vanished and appeared in the surroundings. Under the astonished gazes of many, his spear's range felt almost endless. No one within 10 meters was able to escape the wrath of his blade as he attacked as he pleased. If you were too close, your life would be reaped from yourself. It was as simple as that. PCHU. 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 Swift. Truly swift. The spear shadows practically blotted out the skies as the might of the Morales shone forth. Madmen. Generals of the battlefield. Reapers even amidst the carnage. Their spears blanketed the clouds and layered the earth. Absolute spear domain. Half a dozen squads lost one or two members instantly, some of them even losing all three. Without their organized squadrons, they were no longer able to form their smaller shield formations. And better yet, those that were further away didn't have time to reinforce Vimward and his vice-captains. Aina shot by Lionel, causing blood force to rise into the air as she ripped the life force out of the falling corpses. Lionel smiled. Just me and you. Lionel's gaze locked onto Vimward, the tip of his spear trembling and a rising tornado of golden spear force dancing around him as his three glorious white illusory tails rose into the skies behind him. Vimward's heart skipped a beat, but he immediately forced himself to calm down. Even if Aina held back the other members of his troops from interfering, Lionel was still speaking nonsense. What about the other 71 troops? She couldn't possibly stop them all as well, right? In just a few more breaths, they would be completely surrounded, and they most definitely wouldn't get a chance to shatter another shield. Considering the strength they had shown now, this was already their limit. Lionel definitely couldn't take him down in just a few seconds. Star fusion. An eruption of starry blue force rushed into being around Lionel, making him look like the incarnation of a deity. His pores opened, a dense blue fog akin to a radiant nebula spreading out around him. Combustion. Bang. In an instant it all turned a furious shade of red. Lionel took a step forward, the ground beneath him shattering into an avalanche of rock and stone. In that moment, he remembered when he first came to the Void Palace. Cutting down a single tree was impossible, he couldn't even leave a scratch on the ground. Even using his internal sight beyond a few meters was impossible. But now on his way out, he could do as he pleased. This landscape, if he wanted it to change, it had no right to tell him no. Bang. Vimward's formation shield shattered beneath Lionel's aura alone. A single rogue strand of spear force no thicker than a hair whipping against it, and collapsing its entire structure. It was only now that those watching realized that Lionel had yet to put in his full effort. While others had reached their upper limits, he was still scratching the surface of his potential. Lionel took another step forward, casually flicking his wrist. Bang. The ground his spear swept by rose into the air, forming a hill of earth so large that an entire half of the troops found themselves facing the descent of a mighty mountain crashing toward their heads. Just as Lionel took a third step, he disappeared in a flicker of crimson. When he appeared again, his spear was at Vimward's throat, a moment away from piercing right through. Vimward's body trembled, veins popping out across his forehead until he suddenly roared. Just when it seemed like Vimward would be skewered through, Lionel's spear passed through nothing but air. However, just the residual aura of Lionel's strike alone caused Vimward's two vice-captains to burst into clouds of blood. Lionel slowly retracted his spear. Despite missing, there was a grin on his face as Vimward slowly appeared again about 5 meters from him. The entire battlefield froze, and even in the far-off distance, DiVincenzo and the Void Elders also froze until a furious expression appeared on Gallienne's wrinkled face. Cloud race scum. There was only one race in existence capable of using such a formless movement technique. Vimward had exposed himself, and by proxy he had exposed Zilgella and Urith. If Lionel was 1 for 1, he was almost assuredly 3 for 3 as well. Chapter 1716. Published at 22nd of March, 2023, 7:39 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1716. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1716. Empty. Gallienne's furious roar thundered across the skies. Never in her wildest imagination did she think that Lionel's words would actually not be nonsense, but now that she was aware, what she had to do was even less of an uncertainty. The role of Void Palace was of one track and of one mind: protect the human domain from other races. It was that simple, and it was a mission that hadn't changed for countless years. Vimward's expression changed. At first, he wanted to see if he could do something to change his current situation, or at least take control of it, but he quickly realized that all of his ideas were ridiculous. Take Lionel as hostage? What good would that do when the entire purpose of their trip here was to detain him to begin with? Plus, It was likely that a part of the reason Gallienne's reaction was so explosive was because she had finally found a target to vent on. After just a second, Vimward realized that he had no other options outside of running. He sent a furious gaze toward Lionel. Even now, he had no idea how he had been exposed. If it was so easy to see through the disguise of the cloud race, then they wouldn't be the cloud race. Someone like Lionel was, without exaggeration, an existential risk to their very being. The only race of people that the cloud race didn't dare to play around with were the spirituals, precisely because they could so easily see through them. Vimward had no idea how a human race brat could do the same thing. Seeing Vimward's fury, Lionel smiled and waved. "You should probably start running now. Maybe you can make it out. Good luck." Seeing Lionel's smile, Vimward's body trembled with fury. In a spike of rage, the aura of a seventh-dimensional expert rippled out in all directions, emitting from his body in waves. However, rather than being shocked or scared like Vimward thought Lionel would be, Lionel's smile still hadn't faded. What a joke! If Lionel could see through Vimward's cloud race disguise, why wouldn't he be able to tell that the latter was actually in the seventh dimension? But now Vimward had to make a choice. He could either test his luck and try to kill Lionel, or he could run. If Lionel managed to survive his first strike, he wouldn't have time to send a second before avoiding detection would be impossible. The Void Elders were still far enough away that he and the others could escape, and it would take far more than just a few exchanges to bridge the gap. But the main issue was a matter of whether they would be able to track them or not. If Vimward left right this moment, his trail would disappear by the time they caught up. But if he delayed, there was no telling. It was clear by Lionel's smile that he seemed to understand this quite well. Vimward grit his teeth for a moment before all of his fury vanished into a puff of air. In an instant, he had regained all of his calm, and there was no longer the slightest ripple in his eyes. Without hesitating anymore, he turned and vanished, plumes of cloudy fog and energy following his path. The corner of Lionel's lip curled as he watched Vimward run. At the same moment, Zilgella and Urith no longer hesitated as well, breaking free from their formations and rushing away. What Lionel found interesting, though, was that they were all alone. He couldn't help but wonder what the plan was exactly. Did the Cloud Race plan to overturn Shield Cross Stars with just 3 individuals? That didn't seem likely. It was either that these were rogue members, or Lionel's expression flickered for a moment as chaos ensued. With the collapse of just 3 formations, logically, there should have been more than enough organization remaining to deal with the situation. But the Cloud Race had quite some spectacular methods of their own. As they escaped, a dense foggy gray energy rose into the air, obscuring vision, and making even Lionel feel as though his mind was being attacked. One after another, the formations wavered and collapsed, the glorious shields cracking and shattering right after them. Lionel's eyes narrowed. With a step he appeared by Aina's side. Wrapping an arm around her waist, he took another step and crossed large distances at a time. Boom, boom, boom. Perfect. Lionel thought with a grin. He didn't need to see to know what happened. Just now, Vimward had definitely reached the spatial lock barrier, and used some method to destroy it. In an instant, Lionel felt his emulation spatial force loosen up, and he felt freer to move. In reality, Lionel had many other plans for this day. If he had the skill to draw spatial arrays capable of helping him escape a zone, something that was supposedly impossible up until the moment he did it, this spatial barrier had no method of stopping him either so long as he had some time. He had originally wanted to deal Shield Cross Stars a blow for being so annoying, which was why he had taken this approach. But the idea that they had 3 spies in their ranks that caused their collapse while they were supposedly chasing after a fugitive was far more cathartic than anything else he had planned. In fact, he found it absolutely hilarious. That said, that didn't mean that he would just leave things as is. Taking advantage of the fog, Lionel deployed his starry spirit domain and added some fog of his own. Overlaying it with emulation spatial force, he created an illusion of his surroundings that had everything but an image of himself and Aina, effectively allowing them to disappear into thin air. Lionel was sure that there were many still trying to pay close attention to his actions, but no amount of scrutiny would stop him. In just a few minutes, Unbeknownst to anyone, Lionel stepped onto an empty planetary warship with Aina by his side. Chapter 1717. Published at 22nd of March, 2023, 7:39 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1717. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1717 or me. With a thought, Lionel split into several clones. From start to finish, his dream world was entirely locked onto the vessel, splitting it into components and rebuilding it in his mind. If one looked into his mind right this moment, it would be possible to see tens of thousands of gears, pipes, wires, engine pieces, gas exhausts. The number of things was endless, and even when it seemed like they couldn't be cut down any further, he would still split them into more. In just a few minutes, Lionel understood the flying vessel better than even the engineers who worked on it every day. If he had to, let alone fly it, he could build it from scratch with nothing but raw materials. Of course, Lionel had the segmented cube if he really wanted to escape as stealthily as possible, but where was the fun in that? Off to the side, Aina could only shake her head and smile. With the segmented cube's abilities, they would probably already be a solar system away by now, but this man insisted on never suffering a loss. As far as Lionel saw it, pointing out some traitors in shield cross stars midst might embarrass them, but it was ultimately a net positive for them. As things went, he had just done them a favor, and it wasn't the first favor he had done for the human race either. Considering such a thing, he might as well take some payment for his efforts. They didn't think that they could just use him for free, right? If DiVincenzo knew what Lionel was thinking, he just might die of blood loss just from coughing up so much in rage. This wasn't just any normal planetary warship. Lionel hadn't just targeted any one of them. He had targeted the flagship. In the entirety of Shield Cross stars, there was only one model superior to this one, and it was reserved for Tier 1 star rank officers. Considering the status of such officers, those warships rarely saw the light of day. Even if Lionel had targeted one of the 5 lesser ships that had come, it would have been an unacceptable loss. After all, this was the entirety of DiVincenzo's fleet. To estimate the cost of one of these planetary warships, talking of ors wasn't even appropriate. Instead, one had to speak in terms of revenue of not planets, or quadrants, or galaxies, but sectors. In order to build one such warship, it took gathering the entire profits of one sector for a century, or the profits of 100 sectors for 1 year each. These wouldn't be normal sectors either, but rather 7th-dimensional sectors. In the entirety of the human domain, there were only a few hundred such sectors to begin with. This meant that even if the resources of the whole human domain were pooled together without the slightest reservation, only about 4 or 5 of these ships could be made per year. And that was only if no one cared about spending funds on anything else. To say that stealing this ship was a bit of an overkill was understatement. And Lionel most definitely couldn't claim to be ignorant about it either, considering his status as a craftsman. He simply didn't care. They would just have to obediently swallow this loss. Lionel grinned. Nice. His greatest worry had just vanished into thin air. This ship didn't need to be powered, it was self-sustaining. How lovely, it was like they had put it on a platter just for him. At that moment, all of Lionel's clones were in place and the ship rumbled just a single time, shocking the whole of the Void Palace. DiVincenzo, who had been in mad pursuit of the Cloud Race trio, felt his heart skip a beat. It wasn't that he hadn't wanted to use the ships to rush after them, but the problem was that manning such a large warship required hundreds of crewmen and engineers, but he had deployed them all to chase after Lionel. It would take too much time for them to get back and start everything up. Never had he thought that someone would actually take this opportunity to steal their Tier 2 star warship. If anyone had told him that this would happen before, he would have laughed in their face. How could 2 people steal a planetary warship? He would have thought that one would have to be woefully ignorant to even think such a thing was possible. But it was actually happening right before his eyes. "I'll be taking this as repayment, no need to thank me." Lionel's voice echoed through the void, but he had already stopped paying attention to the situation around him, turning toward Aina with a smile. Aina raised an eyebrow, pretending not to understand the look in Lionel's eye, but before she could react, She was squealing as he swept her into his arms, her battle axe forgotten at the bow of the ship. Lionel carried Aina into the ship, his lips sealing over her own as he walked about with his eyes closed. He cradled her thighs to either side of his hips with his forearms, his two palms firmly planted on her ass. The two of them seemed to completely forget the rumbling of the ship, lost in their own world. They left a trail of clothing in their wake, a piece of fabric falling away with every step that Lionel took. Lionel kicked open a door, slamming it shut behind him with a heel. His movements didn't have even the slightest hitch in them as he pressed Aina down onto a bed, her heavy breathing matching to the rhythm of their hearts. Aina looked into Lionel's eyes, their golden hues slightly misty, slightly red, and mostly loving. What are you focused on more right now? Flying the ship? Or me? The almost succubus-like coercion and temptation in Aina's voice made Lionel as hard as a rock, but he also found the question somewhat amusing. Did the answer matter much? Well, maybe it didn't matter much to him, but she liked to know the answer. Aina felt herself moisten as Lionel pressed against her. She could feel her delicate pink folds spreading apart and her entrance slowly opening. She looked into Lionel's eyes, unable to look away, and he was unable to do the same. When we crash, just know I'm going to blame it on you. Lionel laughed. Aina laughed as well, her eyes filled with a hint of happy tears. She felt nothing but bliss as they fused into one, her moan stifled by the kiss of the man she loved. Chapter 1718. Published at 22nd of March, 2023, 7:39 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1718. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1718. Pop as good as his body felt. Lionel felt as though his mind had entered a state of absolute peace. It was beyond just the feelings, but rather the tacit acceptance that had brought him to this moment. He had been by Aina's side for so long, and he had already lost count of the number of opportunities they had had. However, because he was in his own head about so many things, it was always easy to find an excuse, and to also find contentment in what he had without trying to seek more. After he had made his decision that day, he no longer had any inhibitions. He had already known that when next the two of them had this chance, neither of them would be willing to miss it again. It wasn't a moment of ravenous passion, nor was it emblazoned with emotions like it had almost been so many times before. Rather, it was calm and intimate. They listened to the sound of each other's breathing. They enjoyed the warmth of each other's embrace. And they were both very much present. It could only be really explained in one word: comfortable. There wasn't any pressure on their shoulders, any obligation to act, any fear dictating their actions, or any ulterior motives tainting their thoughts. It couldn't have been any purer. They smiled, they kissed, they even laughed, neither feeling any tension or oppression. Both just seemed to understand how beautiful the moment was. It wasn't perfect. They didn't have fireworks in their air. They were currently on the run as fugitives, and there were probably no small number of individuals who wanted them dead, and yet it all didn't seem to matter in the slightest. In his state of bliss, Lionel suddenly felt his knees go weak. At first he thought the worst. In reality, by this point, it had only been a few minutes. Within his abilities, he knew exactly how long. 183 seconds. Not a second more, not a second less. 3 minutes and 3 seconds. If he collapsed now, he wouldn't ever hear the end of it. Considering his dense vitality, he would be up and at it immediately, but he knew what kind of woman he was dealing with. She wouldn't actually take it to heart, but that didn't mean that she wouldn't be sure to make fun of him to the ends of the earth. Lionel found it all to be ridiculous. Sure, it felt like his cock was in a vice grip of warm and moist clouds as though he was being caressed by the hands of an angel, but he also had a Tier 4 controllability index that gave him perfect control over his body. So long as he wanted to, he should have been able to go on for months if that was what he wanted. But what the fuck was this? This scare had only lasted for a fraction of a second before Lionel realized that this wasn't actually what was happening, and that he wasn't a quick shot. But it was already enough for him to be covered in a cold sweat. Lionel. It was only a small moment, but considering how close they were, How could Aina miss any changes to Lionel? Those gorgeous cherry lips of hers were already curled into a smile as she whispered a hot breath into his ear. The vice grip her moist walls pulsating around him. Lionel knew that she was doing it on purpose. He and Aina had a tacit sort of agreement. They were still stuck in the beauty of the moment, but very soon, it would likely devolve into an all-out war of conquest for bragging rights. Aina lightly bit at Lionel's earlobe, running her hands up and down his defined back as she locked her legs around him. Her voice seemed tinged with concern, but in reality she was coercing him like the little vixen she was. Damn it! Lionel couldn't even counter because of the weakness in his legs. His arms were the only thing stopping him from flopping on top of her like a dead fish. And Aina seemed to have noticed this. Lionel didn't even know how to explain that what she thought was happening wasn't actually what was happening. It felt like that time she walked in on him moaning all over again. He would never live this down. Another squeeze came and Lionel sucked in a cold breath. He couldn't quite focus on exactly what was happening with her, tempting him at every opportunity. He had already locked away most of his mind to man-to-planetary warship, so he didn't have much focus left to give given the situation, which only made him even slower in understanding what was happening. Aina's hips wiggled, pulling back and sinking herself into the bed before rebounding upward. She didn't seem to want to let Lionel off at all, as she used her own methods to force them into another rhythmic trance. Her light moans tickled at Lionel's ears as an odd feeling spread through his body. Lionel couldn't describe it as anything other than weakness. He lost control of himself piece by piece as though he was being forcefully separated from something. Or maybe it was the exact opposite. From his feet, up his legs, through his knees, then his back, and eventually even his hands. By that point, the only things propping him up collapsed. Aina laughed lightly, still a bit oblivious to what was happening. Red in the face, her overwhelming strength easily flipped Lionel beneath her. Her thighs trembled as she rose in a squat, a feeling of euphoria coursing through both of their bodies as she slowly moved up and down. At the same moment, the feeling rose to Lionel's head and he felt a pop. Right then, the sound of a chain snapping resonated through the universe, and Lionel entirely lost control of his body. Aina trembled, feeling a strong pulse within her. She leaned forward, pressing her cheek to Lionel's broad chest with a light smile on her face and a sheen of sweat on her brows. Chapter 1719. Published at 22nd of March, 2023, 7:39 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1719. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1719. Justice? When Lionel came to and his vision cleared, he found himself looking up at an unfamiliar ceiling. It took him a while to realize that the ceiling he was looking toward was the ceiling of the master room of the planetary warship. He wasn't familiar with it because he never really cared to look at its details when he walked in and laid Aina on the bed. To begin with, no one ever used this room. Although it was created for DiVincenzo, seventh-dimensional existences didn't sleep very often, and this planetary warship wasn't used often enough for this room to be necessary considering how expensive it was. As such, it could be said that Lionel and Aina were the very first to use this room. After realizing where he was, it all came back to Lionel, and his lip twitched several times. He still had no idea what had happened just now, but what he did know was that only 4 minutes and 37 seconds had passed from start to finish. It was all over. He would never be able to show his face to the world again. Where was the justice? Maybe if he ran now he wouldn't have to face the music. However, at that moment, Aina, who was laying on his chest, pushed herself up with a smile. She looked happier than Lionel had ever seen her. Half of that was probably because of how satisfied she felt, but there was a hidden amusement in her eyes that Lionel would never miss. Lionel coughed lightly. Something weird happened. I don't really know how to explain it. MHM. Aina nodded twice. With her movement, Lionel's eyes couldn't help but shift to her bouncing breasts. Considering her position, they practically dangled before his mouth, asking him to try and catch one of those delicate pink nipples with his tongue. Aina blinked innocently, seemingly not noticing Lionel's distraction. Her palms were still pressed onto his broad chest, but her wrists slightly turned, pulling her elbows in and pushing her own chest up. A stray bead of sweat fell down her neckline and disappeared between that grand ravine, leaving Lionel's Adam's apple pulsating. If you look too hard, something weird might happen again. Lionel was so distracted that it took him a moment to pick up the teasing words. His cock was already at attention. Given his vitality, he hadn't been joking about how quick he would be to recover. And considering her had seemingly fallen asleep for a small amount of time, he had had more than ample. By now, he was already pressing up between Anna's cheeks, splitting them apart as she continued to sit on him, oblivious to what was coming. What was that? Lionel looked up from Anna's breasts, his hands finding their way to her hips. Anna tilted her head in amusement. She thought that Lionel was still trying to regain some face, so she traced a finger down his chest, her smile blooming. "Nothing, I'm just a bit worried about you," she said lightly. Lionel suddenly grinned. "What are you worried about?" Anna, seemingly finally realizing that something was odd, looked into Lionel's eyes again. Lionel didn't look like someone who had just been defeated. However, Anna wasn't one to back down either. "There's no need to be embarrassed. You're just young. So long as we practice more, I'm sure you'll get better. We have all the time in the world." Anna smiled brightly, rising up into a full-seated position and raising her hands to her hair. She allowed Lionel's eyes to scan her body as she smoothed out her long, black strands, her every breath causing her breasts to ripple and her toned torso to flex just the slightest bit. A small and well-trimmed bush just barely obstructed Lionel's vision of what was below, but he could still very clearly feel its moistness and slight stickiness as she shifted from side to side imperceptibly. Despite her words, Anna didn't see Lionel falter. In fact, his smile became even brighter. Slap. The sound echoed through the mostly quiet room, and Anna's body shuddered beside itself. She could feel the faint stinging pain on her ass cheek, her legs squeezing together slightly, but finding Lionel's body in the way. Anna released a slight haggard breath and her gaze went misty. Before she could even understand what had just happened, she went from her position in dominance to being pinned beneath Lionel once again. But this time, her face was pressed against the soft sheets of the bed, her ass arched upward in full view. A tingle coursed up Anna's spine, her body twitching as she felt Lionel lightly press against her entrance. "You said we need practice, right?" Even though she could no longer see Lionel's face, Anna could imagine the grin on his face. Her mind went blank. She could just barely feel the two strong hands gripping her waist. Even if she wanted to run now, she most definitely couldn't. A dripping moistness fell from between her legs, sliding down her delicate pink folds, and rounding around a sensitive little pink button before falling toward the sheets. Everything about that moment was hyper-real to her. Even the slightest goosebump that raised across her skin making her shudder. She gasped when she felt Lionel enter her. It was deep, almost too deep, almost like he was trying to press against her heart from the back. Lionel pressed a hand down and onto the small of Anna's back, his strokes deep and slow. Each was perfectly measured and timed down to a fraction of a second. He was an absolute machine, only getting a small tick faster every few seconds. Anna felt herself slowly losing consciousness, not quite sure which way was up and which way was down. But every time she was just about to be pushed over the edge, another slap would come, shuddering her awake and causing her feet to wiggle up and down uncontrollably. She tried to squirm away and escape, but every time Lionel only pressed down harder, pinning her into the bed. Lionel grinned a devilish grin. "Don't run now, we're just getting started." Lionel pulled back until the length of his cock almost fell out entirely, pulsing at the entrance for just a moment before sliding all the way back in. Anna finally couldn't control herself. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head, her body convulsed wildly, and she bit into the cushioned sheets beneath her. However, as though he didn't sense a single thing, Lionel simply kept going. Pride? Competition? Victory? Defeat? She forgot it all. Just a few minutes in, she was moaning so loudly and without restraint that her coercion spread across the depths of space. An hour and her voice became too hoarse to make any noise, and all that came out were whimpers. 3 hours and she laid on the bed limply, the only thing making it clear that she was still alive being the haggard breathing and slight twitches from time to time. From start to finish, Lionel's devilish grin never faded. What could he say? He hated to lose, even when it came to bedroom activities. Chapter 1720. Published at 22nd of March, 2023, 7:39 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1720. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1720. Thoughts. Lionel finally let Aina go when she really couldn't handle anymore. In truth, given the strength of her body, it was really hard to hit that limit. Even going for days wouldn't be a problem. But this wasn't an issue of her strength, but rather one of her mind and nerves. There was only so much she could take before she was really overloaded and pleasure became pain. And unfortunately for her, Lionel was an expert at reading and reacting to such a thing. Lionel smiled with a more than content smile on his face, a feeling of euphoria spreading out across his body as he delved into the deepest parts of Aina's body, releasing what he had been building up for several hours already. It was the greatest feeling in the world. Too great to be described in just a few words, so he didn't even bother to try. He collapsed onto the bed, beads of sweat falling down his brow. He was ready to pull out and take a nice rest, but Aina's hand gripped his wrist, which rested on her hip. Toward this, he could only chuckle inwardly. Of all the things this woman found the strength left to do, it was actually this. It was more than a little amusing. Lionel wrapped his arms around her waist and obliged, falling into a deep sleep. Lionel awoke to the shuddering of the world around him. For a moment, he was groggy and confused until he snapped awake. Shit. Before, Lionel had been joking about crashing the ship, but to think he would actually mess up so royally. Lionel shut up. The situation wasn't bad. He had just accidentally navigated the warship into an asteroid belt. As things went, it could be far worse. But then again, it could also be far better. Running through the protocols, Lionel sent out his clones once again, and activated a series of commands. Soon, the ship was enveloped by a force field of repellent force, and the shaking came to a stop. What shit-tier luck, Lionel grumbled internally. 99% of space is empty, and I just had to be the lucky guy that ran into an asteroid belt. Luckily, the ship was just fine. The rocks of this asteroid belt couldn't possibly hope to harm a ship of this caliber. It was more likely that the asteroid belt would be ground to dust before a scratch was left on this vessel. But Lionel wanted to be more cautious. After all, he definitely couldn't afford to build this ship currently, and he only had one of them. Of course, there would come a time where this ship was useless to him, but that would be a problem for the future. The so-called self-sustaining nature of the ship was due to its self-contained nuclear fusion reactor. Given the core's quality, it could withstand a decade of heavy usage without running out of energy, and the best part was that there wouldn't be any significant changes until it ran to the very end of its lifespan. That said, heavy usage implied war-torn times, and the human domain hadn't seen such a thing in a very, very long time. Under normal, more benign use cases, even lasting a century wouldn't be a problem. This was only the third time this ship was ever used, as there was rarely a need for it. As such, its core was very fresh and new. Lionel didn't mind using it up a bit to make sure that nothing untoward happened to the ship as a whole. Lionel exhaled and wiped a bit of sweat off his brow. This could have definitely been worse. He could have been woken up to their crashing through a planet. This warship wasn't called a planetary warship without reason. It was bigger than most moons and could definitely run through some planets. The real trouble was what kind of damage would result in doing such a thing. Lionel was unwilling to find out just yet, and he was lucky that he didn't have to. With everything handled, Lionel went back to the master room to find that Aina was still sleeping. This silly girl had actually slept through a near-death catastrophe. He could only speechlessly commend her. Lionel sat on the bed and found his eyes drooping again. This time, he learned his lesson and put the warship in idle. He couldn't put his shiny new toy in harm's way again. He crawled into bed and shared the covers with Aina, his consciousness fading again. He didn't know why, but he just felt more tired than usual. As he went to sleep, he had vague thoughts about what he should do next and how to prepare. Gathering talents from the Void Palace was obviously impossible now, so the only thing he could do was rely on more unproven talents. That said, he was quite lucky in this regard. Others would be screwed. But would he? Earth's territory would produce the greatest talents of the human domain given enough time. This was the power of a place with eighth-dimensional potential. It seemed that he would definitely have to return to Earth first and reunite with his brothers. Then he could consider matters about the Oryx and the Umbra family. According to Valor, the Morales family had chosen to postpone the air war until they all entered the seventh dimension. So he could have quite some time. Lionel could feel that progress had slowed to a crawl after entering the sixth dimension. He was probably still a month or two away from entering Tier 2. At that pace, it would take him 2 years just to make it to Tier 9. The odds of that were slim though. In all likelihood, it would take longer and longer the further he progressed. The fact he felt Tier 2 was just 2 months away in the first place was more a testament to his talent than anything else. Lionel drifted off to sleep once again, unable to finish his thoughts. Chapter 1721. Published at 22nd of March, 2023, 7:39 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1721. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1721 mattered less. Lionel woke up again much later, his mind still in a bit of a fog. He chose to keep his eyes closed, lying there and letting a steady sort of peace overcome him. Within the depths of his mind, the Emperor's Might tablet floated about. Ever since Lionel had gotten it, he hadn't gotten much out of it. This wasn't necessarily for lack of trying, but the tablet simply didn't respond much to him. Part of this was probably because he wasn't entirely compatible with him. His own King's Might was a mutated version of the Emperor's Might of this tablet, so it wasn't entirely certain that he could make use of it to begin with. It had to be remembered that the bronze tablet had been with the Luxnix family for centuries, but their main lineage factor was still the snowy star owl. Just having a tablet wasn't enough to demand its secrets from it. It required compatibility and talent, 2 things of which Lionel was entirely sure he had for the Emperor's Might tablet. Lionel couldn't help but think of the conflict between himself and his grandfather. The root cause of it was a difference in how they saw the world. Back then, Lionel was quite certain that there would come a time where he and his grandfather would be on such polar opposite sides that battle would be the only way to settle things. Lionel wasn't sure how that moment would come about, or even when it would. He just felt that it was nigh inevitable. In recent times, though, the way he looked at the world had also begun to shift, and so had his mentality. He still felt far more like a king than he did an emperor, but it was nowhere near as firm as it had been in the past. In fact, now that he thought about it, what situation had he been in when he forced the Emperor's Might tablet to come to him in the first place? Back then, he had been infuriated, furious that the world was forcing him to make such a choice. But in the end, he had still made it without hesitation. He chose Aina over the world. That was the mental state he had been in when he forced the tablet to come to him. And following that, there had been a slight shift in the way that he viewed things, even becoming more unrestrained and unfettered in his actions. The way Lionel had seen things, a king was a man of the people. He curated the loyalty of his closest noblemen. He ate with his generals and shed blood with them on the battlefield. He could see things from both his perspective and that of others, formulating a world for everyone under his strength. An emperor, however, he was lofty, untouchable. He schemed and pulled at the puppet strings of his ministers and noble court, seeking balance not through understanding but through power. He sat on a throne and looked down on the people. There were simply too many of them for him to care about their individual plights. All that matters was that he would maintain his strength. There was an air of selflessness to being a king that an emperor didn't have, that they almost couldn't have. But then the question was that if by virtue of the job at hand an emperor couldn't be a king, then how exactly would it be possible for Lionel to be a king if his goal was to subdue the whole of the dimensional verse? Wouldn't the vastness of an emperor's territory then become his problem? How could he be a king if the territory he governed was so abnormally large? How could he still be selfless? Emperors struggled to maintain their humanity even when their subjects were all human. The dimensional verse had the human race, the Rapax race, the spirituals race, the cloud race, the dwarven race. The list felt almost endless, and each of them had their own cultures, their own perspectives and philosophies. Was his dream even possible to achieve while maintaining the air of a king? In truth, subconsciously, Lionel already felt that he had lost such a right. How could he continue to claim to be selfless, to be a man of the people, when he had chosen his woman over trillions of lives? Did he even still have the heart to be a king? Or more importantly, would a king always have to sacrifice his queen for victory? If that was true, I don't want to be a king. It was a simple decision, but it was one that Lionel was unwavering on. No matter what the situation, no matter the circumstances, he would never choose to sacrifice Aina. Simply put, in the face of Aina, he didn't give a damn about the world. There were very few things that Lionel was so certain of, but it was only upon realizing this so firmly that he chose to truly open his heart to Aina again. All of the other things they had gone through didn't seem to matter anymore. There was a time that he had almost given her up for the sake of this dream. But there was also ironically a point in his life that nothing mattered to him outside of her happiness. It was funny, he had once again become that very same lovesick boy who confessed his feelings over 500 times. But somehow, it felt different than it had before. Less superficial, more weighty, greater in substance. Sometimes how you acted, or what you knew mattered less than how you had come to know them. The difference between Lionel of back and the Lionel of now was that the Lionel of then didn't have any goals or aspirations. But the Lionel of now was willing to give those goals and aspirations up without a second thought. If you compared the two, which love was worth more? Chapter 1722. Published at 22nd of March, 2023, 7:39 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1722. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1722. Be obedient. Lionel continued to smile, his body feeling quite relaxed despite the slight fogginess of his mind. Maybe in the past he would have felt pressed for an answer, but right this moment he simply didn't care that much. The answer was meaningless to him for now, but as for the Emperor's Might tablet, he felt that it was about time it be obedient. Lionel's dream force descended upon the tablet from all sides, suffocating it within its presence. The Northern Star Bronze tablet had required Lionel to have a dense light and star force affinity before it could show him its secrets. As for the Emperor's Might tablet, Lionel was almost certain that it was entirely reliant on his mental abilities. Ultimately, the Emperor Might lineage factor was one of the minds. It used the presence of an emperor to strengthen and impose changes onto the real world. It was essentially like a coercion ability, but far more tangible. Before he purged his King's Might lineage factor, or at least the humanoid form he had allowed it to take, Lionel's King's Might was also capable of imposing changes onto the world. In fact, right now, the greatest application of his King's Might was actually his spear. Whenever he spoke a word, or resonated with the sound of the world, or painted an image with his spear stroke, these were all facets of imposing his mind onto the world. This was actually why he was able to grasp his grandfather's teachings so quickly. He had a shortcut to doing so others didn't have. All of these things were just different applications of his King's Might. Lionel had the idea brewing in his mind for a long time. But if his King's Might was able to work so well with his spear force, then there was nothing stopping it from working with his other forces as well. Like that, he should be able to use his King's Might lineage factor to increase his force manipulation. Of course, this would be the more subtle of the two force manipulation types. But it was also the one guaranteed to have a powerful outcome from what he had seen in the zone. The trouble was that his grandfather's method worked well for weapons forces, but it didn't translate so well to other forces. Lionel wasn't actually sure why this was, though he did have a guess. His grandfather's methods required forming the force into what you willed it to be. The words of poetry and calligraphy were constructed by you. The melody of a musical tune was composed by you. The lines of a beautiful painting were formulated by you. None of these things were inherently unique to the force itself. Compared to other forces, weapon force were more malleable and fit to the whims of their user. Although there were certain parameters they fell into, they generally had looser restrictions, whereas other forces were quite focused in their efforts. A fire force would never be able to freeze something. Likewise, a water force would never burn something. Or at least, That was what Lionel believed in his own limited comprehension of matters. Regardless, this was why Lionel was so invested in taking the next step in applying the beauty of force arts to his spearmanship, because this would thus allow him to apply said comprehension to other forces and slowly raise his force manipulation capabilities. Luckily, he had found a clue in how to do this during his battle with the Sword faction. But it would still take time for him to make it a reality, as he would have to start from nothing and build it all up himself. So, right now, show me your secrets. You have no right to hide from me. He had let the tablet sit too idly for too long, even letting it get cocky. Since it was residing in his mind, it would have to pay some rent. Bang! Lionel felt as though an explosion of gold had gone off in his mind, but other than shuddering once, he remained unmoved. Quite frankly, the Emperor's Might tablet had been tricked. It thought that it had met a pure-blooded descendant back, then so it had rushed toward Lionel with happiness, hoping that its glory would blind the world once again. However, when it entered Lionel, not only did it find out that Lionel was just a mixed breed, it also found out that his lineage factor had mutated from the perfect path. The tablet had wanted to leave after realizing this, but this mixed pup's mind was actually more powerful than it had originally given him credit for. Even it had to admit that Lionel was very suited to the Emperor's Might lineage factor, if only he was willing to give up this mutated abomination that was his King's Might. But Lionel was just as stubborn as one might expect from an Emperor's Might wielder. He wanted all the secrets of the tablet without giving up anything. Of course, Lionel knew that much like the Luxnix family's tablet could bestow lineage factors unto him, the Emperor's Might tablet could also bestow the Emperor's Might lineage factor unto him as well, purging him of the mutations he had. However, Lionel was unwilling to do this, not because he was attached to King's Might, but because he knew that the mutation to what was originally his Emperor's Might lineage factor had happened because of his Metal Synergy lineage factor. Due to this, his King's Might lineage factor and Metal Synergy lineage factor were somewhat linked now. If he purged one, it might cause undue and unforeseeable changes to the other. The more synergized his lineage factors, the better. Lionel already had too many abilities. He didn't want them to be any more difficult to fuse into a single power source than they had to be. So this unruly tablet would have to be obedient. If it could show him a path better than the one he was on now, he would accept its changes. But until it could do that, it could forget about making him change his mind. Lionel's incarnation within his dream world reached forward, a wild grin on its face. He grabbed the tablet, finally seeing through to its first layer. Chapter 1723. Published at 7th of April, 2023, 8:55 and 43 seconds AM. Chapter 1723. Fear if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's mind went blank for a moment, and when he came to, he was standing within a world of green and blue. He stood on a platform at the start of a long road of them. Although he wasn't sure if it meant anything, the one he stood upon was particularly green, as though it had been carved out of precious jade. Lionel looked around. There was nothing to his back or sides, but an endless miasma of greenish-blue energies. Other than that, there was only the path ahead and nothing else. Lionel couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Now that he thought about it, he hadn't exactly asked Aina what her experience with the Blood Sovereign tablet was, but honestly he didn't think that he had to. After all, blood sovereignty wasn't exactly a lineage factor, as far as he was aware. So his personal experience with the Northern Star tablets would be far more useful in this regard, or so he thought. But in his experience with those tablets, he had never. Wait, that wasn't true. When he formed his Aurora Panda lineage factor, he had entered a world and even experienced the forms of all three behemoth-like creatures. In fact, he had even been able to interact with them and pick from them. And if he took another step back, he hadn't been conscious when he formed his starry-tailed fox lineage factor. He had just woken up one day with it. An oddity that he still didn't have any answers for either. If things were looked at like this, was it really so odd for a tablet to have a hidden space? In fact, if he really thought about it, even one of his greatest treasures, the silver tablet he had gotten from Valiant Heart Mountain, had an inner space. That inner space wasn't exactly like this one, but it contained a large number of floating souls from that zone. Souls that he could reawaken so long as he invested enough energy into them. That aside, it effectively had a hidden world of its own as well. So maybe it would be weirder if the Emperor's Might tablet didn't have such a thing. Interesting. Lionel's eyes narrowed. Even with all of these things being true, there was something different about this place. All signs pointed to it wanting him to walk forward. So since he didn't have anything better to do at the moment, he did exactly that. Lionel's foot rose and he tried to reach the next platform, but he suddenly felt very small. Before he even got halfway, he frowned and retracted his foot. He felt inadequate? It was an odd feeling to pinpoint, maybe because he was so unfamiliar with it. For some reason, as he was taking that step forward, he was suddenly bombarded with thoughts that he wasn't worthy of doing so. By the time he got halfway, the illusion of his thoughts became reality, and the next platform actually seemed to get further away from him instead of closer. Lionel was aware enough to feel that it was likely a trick of his mind, but even if he was aware, it still felt all too real. In fact, he felt that if he tried to force it and press forward anyway, he would misjudge where to place his foot, causing him to fall to his death. Although Lionel knew that this must just be a projection of his mind because his dream force affinity was high enough to differentiate, that didn't mean that he wouldn't be harmed by such a thing. It was very likely that a death here would cause harm to his soul. Considering the fact the human race had very little research on the soul, and anything there was could only be considered to be in its infantile stages, there was simply no way that Lionel would be able to find a method to heal an injury to his soul in the human domain. Unfortunately, Lionel wasn't very certain if his healing capabilities could extend to his soul or not, and he wasn't willing to risk it. He could feel the symbiotic sort of harmony that currently kept his body and soul in balance. In fact, he could see aspects of the world he never had before thanks to the separation of his body and soul. It was because of this that he could see through the disguises of the cloud race so easily. He was able to look past the forms of their bodies and look into something they had no ability to change. Their souls. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. What a stubborn tablet, it wanted to put him through the ringer. Lionel felt that the tablet was more sentient than any other treasure he had ever met. Or it might have been more accurate to say close to sentient. If he had to guess, this treasure was likely something a step beyond life grade. Or even if it shared the same category, it was near its extremities. It could actually throw a tantrum when it wanted to. Lionel smiled lightly, his foot beginning to rise up again. Silly tablet, it's going to take more than illusion to scare me. If there's an illusion in this world that can fool more dream force affinity, I'll give it to you. Lionel leapt forward, the fear overwhelming his mind again. However, he had already calculated the exact distance. Bang! He landed firmly on the next platform, his body swaying somewhat and his face feeling somewhat pale. During the final moments before he landed there, it all hit him at once. He even felt like he was free-falling into an abyss. Even after his feet landed, he thought it was just an illusion of the mind, and that he had miscalculated. This was indeed quite a scary first step. It felt completely overwhelming. Lionel looked up and saw the staircases extending to infinity. His eyes couldn't help but narrow as he took deep heaving breaths. Chapter 1724. Published at 7th of April, 2023, 8:55 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1724. Let this be. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Fear wasn't something that Lionel could ever remember feeling, or at the very least, any memories of when he was were completely unimportant because he had likely been too young for it to matter. Even when the metamorphosis descended onto Earth, and he was thrust into life and death situations almost immediately, he had never really wavered in such a way. He could remember his first entry into the Mayan tomb quite clearly, and although he had felt apprehension, fear wasn't really at the forefront of his thoughts. In fact, the boldest emotion he remembered feeling from that time was guilt due to the lives he had taken. Even back then, he was calm and cool under pressure, able to use his smarts to get him out of situations he otherwise had no business getting out of. By the end of those few days, he had become a war machine, killing with every step and using those olden guns as though they were pistols. Looking back now, Lionel was much calmer about the matter and didn't feel the same fluctuations, but he could still remember it all clearly. Just days after that he entered war-torn France and battled alongside some of the bravest men in history without feeling inadequate. And not much longer after that he battled against an entire fort on his own with nothing more than a cold expression. In fact, now that Lionel thought about it, the greatest instance of fear he had experienced ever since entering the dimensional verse wasn't related to himself at all, but was rather Anna's. He could still remember how she shivered in the face of the puppet master when she lost control of her body. But now, Lionel was feeling so much fear that his breathing hurried, his skin turned a pasty white color, and he was completely drenched in sweat. Every step forward made him feel as though he was suffering the worst kind of torture. In reality, the only thing keeping him going was his own stubbornness. After a while, his smile faded and he became quite a bit angry. There was no doubt that this tablet was tweaking and pulling at the strings of his mind as he pleased. Every time he completed a calculation for a leap, he was absolutely certain of how far he had to jump. He would even see it through the whole way. However, even so, the fear would come in stronger and stronger waves. The only way for this to be happening is for this to go beyond just illusions. The Emperor's Might tablet was directly influencing his soul. What pissed Lionel off was that he didn't seem to have a way to stop it. In this world, he was nothing more than a mortal. He could only jump and leap just the same way anyone else of the third dimension would need to. He had no access to his forces, and all he could do was rely on his ability index and innate calculative abilities. Bang! Lionel nearly stumbled and fell, heaving in deep gasps. His jaw was steeled and his gaze was a blazing red. He was convinced. This fear wasn't his own. It was just a fear that this tablet was forcing him to feel, but it was all too real, all too tangible, all too indistinguishable from what true fear should feel like. Gritting his teeth, Lionel jumped again. The rush of fear came. Even though his momentum was perfect, even though his arc in the air didn't falter, even though the platform appeared right beneath his feet as it always did and he landed firmly, Lionel looked back and saw all the platforms he had come from. He felt like he was really nearing some sort of psychological limit, but he had only climbed up 9 stairs, while up ahead, there looked to be an infinite more to go. Damn tablet! Lionel grit his teeth so hard they nearly cracked. He bent his knees once more, jumping forward. The rush came again, the onslaught of irrational fear. He imagined that this would be what people who feared heights would feel like if they stood on a glass floor at the top of a skyscraper. It was completely irrational. You knew that the glass floor could hold up 100 times your weight easily, and yet that fear would still come in waves. Every time he leapt up, that fear would come again, even stronger than the last time. It was relentless. If Lionel felt that he had one weakness, it was probably his willpower. Willpower was something that you honed through hardship. You couldn't just be born with it. With how easy Lionel's life had been, with how much talent he had, with how much confidence he had in himself, how could his willpower be great? Oftentimes, he relied on emotion to give himself the illusion of willpower, but he never really proved himself in this regard. He could still remember that day, back when he was still in the third dimension, and trying to awaken his metal synergy lineage factor for the first time. Compared to the pain that he had experienced since then, in battles with his life on the line, in practicing heart-rending methods, in being eaten alive, that pain was child's play. And yet, back then it had hurt him so much that he almost gave up entirely. He had been just a small moment from doing so. Despite the fact that he had gone through much worse since then, Lionel couldn't say that his willpower was suddenly amazing. He would be lying to himself. Today he felt that this was only being affirmed. He had only moved up 10 stairs of what must have been tens of thousands, and yet his mind already wanted to give way. Lionel grit his teeth, his gaze blazing. He was unwilling. Since he hadn't experienced hardship before, let this be his hardship. Chapter 1725. Published at 7th of April, 2023, 8:55 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 1725. Pride. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Images of his uncle flashed in Lionel's mind. He had never seen his father struggle before. That man seemed to do everything with an incomparable ease, as though everything was in the palm of his hands. His uncle, however, had struggled twice before him. The first time when he tried to complete the painting of a spear and failed, and the second time was when he revealed to Lionel that beneath his golden armor, he was entirely drenched in sweat. Back then, Lionel could see the straining of his muscles, the every twitch of their individual fibers. He had felt that his uncle was at his very limits, and yet he put his golden armor back on as though nothing at all had happened. Lionel didn't know what was drawing his uncle forward. Maybe it was revenge for Lionel's grandfather and his father, or maybe it was something that Lionel had no idea about. However, whatever it was, Lionel knew that his uncle was working far harder every day than he ever had before. Lionel only seemed to want to work hard when something caught his interest, but was that really being hard-working? Anyone could focus on something that fascinated them. Maybe he was only slightly special because of how long he could focus on it, but this didn't make him better than someone else. He was just lucky enough to have a mind capable of focusing like this. But once again, that wasn't willpower. Lionel jumped forward again, his breathing haggard. He felt like he had just run a marathon, his heart threatening to leap out from his throat, and his muscles pumped with so much adrenaline and lactic acid that they might just give out any time now. He was a person who was easily bored. Nothing truly moved him. When you broke down everything into its logical components, maybe that was just the inevitable extreme you would reach. Or maybe that was the end you come to when you had too much talent at your fingertips. Or maybe it was a combination of both. Lionel knew these things about himself, but changing them wasn't exactly a matter of just thinking it, which was an ironic thing for him of all people to say considering the sheer control he had over his body. But much like his love of Aina, this part of his personality was so deeply ingrained that it felt difficult to weed out. Sometimes he felt like a lofty existence overlooking the entire universe. So lofty in fact that nothing was worth his attention, nothing was worth his interest. However, sometimes he would also feel a sort of unique agitation, an agitation that was usually linked to Aina in some shape or form, or his father in other ways. Only the two of them seemed capable of pulling in directions he never thought he would go. It was odd because there were definitely other people that he loved. He loved his mother, he loved his brothers, even his grandmother had a piece of his heart. But for whatever reason, they weren't as solidly ingrained. Lionel actually wasn't sure if that was how everyone felt, or if he was just uniquely psychotic. Regardless of what the answer was, he knew that he needed to change long ago. But shrugging off those feelings were impossible, and they only became more troublesome to get rid of whenever he did something else astounding. He had brought humanity's future out of a zone when everyone else thought that such a thing was impossible. He toyed with the records of Void Palace, like it wasn't a place the greatest geniuses of humanity gathered. He might have been defeated at the hands of the fiend-class geniuses of that zone, but weren't they also several tiers above him? Now that he knew that force manipulation existed, what would stop him from crushing them beneath his feet in a few years? The worst part about these thoughts was that he wasn't wrong. They were perfectly correct, and he was also right to be prideful about them. But even so, Lionel growled and jumped again, landing heavily before slipping and falling to one knee. At this point, the only thing keeping him going was pride. He didn't want to give up after traveling up such a pathetic distance. He felt more furious every time he even thought of giving up. What was wrong with him? Was he really so pathetic? Where had his backbone gone? It felt like all of his weaknesses were laid bare. By the time he made it to the 20th step, he could only gasp and heave on all fours. Pride. It was his greatest downfall. He had originally come to the Void Palace with such excitement, but the moment he felt disappointed by the geniuses he came across, he became bored once again, unwilling even to put in his full effort. Lionel clenched his jaw, pushing himself up. He grabbed the edge of the platform with a hand and pushed off both feet, propelling himself forward. Bang! He barely caught the edge of the next ledge. The distance and height difference between the platforms was being wider and taller. He squeezed his lats, pulling himself up slowly and rolling onto the 37th step. His chest billowed into waves, the strength of his breathing almost causing cyclones in the air. Pride. He gasped. He pushed himself up to his feet, stumbling again before sliding into a running start. Since normal jumping wouldn't work anymore, he would run. Lionel unleashed a roar as he jumped, landing on the 38th step with a heavy roll. Since his willpower was pitiful, he would accept that, embrace it even. He didn't need willpower because he was so talented. He didn't need power because he was arrogant, because he was prideful. He wouldn't let this damn tablet slow his steps. Those with willpower could endure. Those with pride could conquer. These steps would just be another conquest. Lionel landed heavily on the 50th step before pushing himself up to his feet, his gaze shimmering with a blinding, almost feral, light. I chose my woman over the world. If even the weight of the world could not make me bow, what right do you have to do so? Lionel broke out into a sprint, his toes catching the side of the platform as he launched himself forward, barely catching the edge of the 51st step with his forearm. You're tuning in to the Lee May's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.